Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be joining us from. Jason and I are back after a little bit of a Vegas interlude. We went to Veeam for the first time in 3 years. It's been a long time, a lot of virtual events. Before we jump into it, though, we want to give a huge shout out to just a few members of our production team, Mark and Catronell. They work very hard behind the scenes. They do great stuff. We saw them, Jason, do amazing stuff in prep for VeeamON, at
Yep.
VeeamON, post VeeamON, and then now back on our live stream.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is far more than a two-person show. So Mark, Kat, and all those who back y'all in the weeks when you're not here, can't believe we're still doing this a year and a half later, 2 years later. It's crazy.
It truly is, truly is. And speaking of what we're doing, Jason, at VeeamON, we got a chance to talk through a lot of the research that you, myself, our colleague Julie Webb have been putting together and presenting. In fact, probably no exaggeration to say close to 50 episodes or so of this very live stream have been from that kind of research. And one of the things that we noticed early on when we did what we call the Data Protection Trends Report was a lot of interest around cyber, and we followed up on that. Maybe take us through a little bit of that.
Yeah, so one of the questions that we asked this year in the Data Protection Trends Report that came out back in February, and by the way, the URL for that, if you want to go download that report, is VEE.am/DPR22. We'll go ahead and put that in the chat in the three forums as well. So one of the questions was around what does modern data protection really look like? And so again, as always, you could choose all that apply. And then beyond that, then choose what's most important. If we could go ahead and bring up that slide while we're at it.
Speaking of, I was remiss in not giving a quick shout out to put in comment where you're coming from. Speaking of global surveys, Jason, and this is the largest, I'm sure you're going to take us through that. But speaking of the globe, give us a little comment about where you may be tuning in from. You can see popping up now is where the production staff happens to be, but we'd love to see where you might be tuning in from as well. We've got myself in Colorado, Jason, Texas, Mark over in Georgia, and Catronell over in Europe in there. But let's see if we can turn some more things green.
Yeah, so far we got, according to the map here, we got 4 people from 4 countries. So the Data Protection Trends Report, a little bigger than that, right? So 3,393 respondents, 28 countries along the way, and statistically tied for second place on most important attribute of a modern data protection system was for it to integrate with cyber, to recognize that that cyber and backup and disaster recovery should not be thought of as separate initiatives within most companies. Now, when we look at more of that data, though, from DPR, we saw something that really kind of caught our attention. And Dave, I'll admit, I was a little surprised it was this high, right? Because I think a lot of times in the media, we just get used to the sensationalism that's out there. But of those that were responded to the survey, only 1 in 4 said they had not had at least one cyber event in 2021. The majority, as you can see here, had at least 2 cyber events. And then you can see here, the bad news on this is that in that data protection report, we saw 47% on average of production data is encrypted by the bad actors per attack, right? And again, we're seeing here a majority are doing more than one. And of that, folks are only able to recover about 2/3. So we saw that, and the Data Protection Trends Report is kind of like the tips of many icebergs, right? And so we wanted to double down on it, and we believe this is, again, the largest of its kind in that there's 4 different personas and 1,000 respondents. And here's the fun part. It wasn't fun for them, but all 1,000 respondents had at least one cyber attack in 2021. So we really wanted to kind of double down on, hey, let's go talk to the folks that actually went through this. What did they find? What did they learn? Super scary stuff. And Dave, the URL's on the bottom of the screen there.
Yeah, I definitely encourage everyone to check this out. This is the industry's largest report, as Jason's mentioning, and you owe it to yourself to get educated, to get this data. You can't get it anywhere else. And Jason, I worry too sometimes of over-rotating. Ambulance chasing is a phrase. I'm not sure if that translates well rest of world, but it basically just means jumping on the bandwagon. However, this is not a bandwagon. This is not something that is being sensationalized. This is something that unfortunately far too many of us are actually experiencing. And I like what our boss, the CTO here at Veeam, likes to say about that 24% that says they were not attacked. That's possible that it's just 1 out of 4 approximately that don't have visibility. They're not aware of whether or not their large multinational organization has been successfully infiltrated or not. So don't read too much confidence as if 1 out of 4 is the best odds in the world. But 1 out of 4 doesn't think or doesn't know if they've been compromised. 3 out of 4 know that they were. Any way you look at it, those are very poor odds.
Yeah, considering the fact that that all we were talking about in Vegas last week, when you weren't there, you were gambling, right? So at this point, are you gambling with the company, right? So 1 in 4, best case, you have not been attacked. I was also surprised, and this actually, when we first walked the some of the subject matter experts on ransomware through the data findings, and we said, "Wow, 1 out of 4, is that right?" And our friend Chris Hoff actually pointed out the fact, I think it was Chris, who said that on average, bad actors are in the environment up to 200 days before you ever find out they were there. So of that 1 in 4, that 24%, who knows how many of them are just at 199 days or less? They just don't know it yet. And that might even be scarier than the stats of the 60% or more. If it was Chris or maybe it was our other friend Rick Vandover, we have more than 2 friends, but they were the 2 that weighed in on this data. I also was surprised to find out how many times the same organizations are revisited.
Yes.
By the same bad actors, right? So Chris talks about it like the school bully. Once you paid them your lunch money one time, the next time they're hungry, they just come back again. I think of it more like being an ATM. Once you got somebody's pin, but however you want to think of that math, that recidivism is actually, I think, really, really scary. So, what do you think? Shall we do take a look at the map really quick, and then let's take a look at some of the data that we did?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got a lot here to point to. If we look at the map, we can see in North America, Canada, which always lights up a good portion of geography.
There you go.
North America, we've got Canada. In the United States, we have Utah, Ohio, Colorado, Atlanta, Georgia. Those are repeats, meaning not me in Colorado, someone else, not our producer in Georgia, but someone else. Then if we look into rest of world, we've got Bulgaria, Netherlands, Poland, Turkey, Madrid, Spain, Armenia, and starting to look rest of world. Brazil, of course, great place. Jason, you always like to comment on the food in Brazil.
Yep, and the wine. Don't forget
And the wine. And then in Africa, we've got Angola, Kenya, South Africa, and Ethiopia. And I think Angola and Ethiopia may be some first for us. I think Ethiopia for sure. And then looking over in APJ, India and Hong Kong. So appreciate all of that. Outstanding. Well, and Jason, you were talking about sort of the frequency of events of when you get hit and then get re-hit. What we saw in the data protection trends research report is, again, roughly 1 out of 4 said they weren't hit. But of the other 75, actually it was technically 76% that did get hit, the most likely occurrence was 2 times or 3 times in the last 12 months. So talk about odds. This is such an indiscriminate kind of issue that we face. And I like what some of the people I heard at Veeam last week referring to this as a crime of opportunity. I think about it as like the fisherman throwing the net out into the sea. He or she may not know what they're fishing for. They're just looking for something, and that something could be your business, meaning we hear of state-targeted events or specific companies getting targeted, but the vast majority of this is any company, any size, any location or geography. It's just completely indiscriminate.
Yeah, I was really surprised. The more time I spend with real security professionals and they talk about things how, in the bad actor circles, they've productized ransomware. You can go to a website and you can launch ransomware from there. And then you come back a couple weeks later, kind of like, throwing that net out or looking for a trap that you set in the woods. And all of a sudden, hey, look, I caught something. And then you can act on it. And it doesn't matter. In fact, over the next several weeks, we have a whole series planned around this where we look at Did it matter based on size of org? Did it matter based on, did it come from the robo or the cloud or the edge or the data center? Did those things matter? So we're going to do some myth busting along the way. These are some of our mostest, favoritist stats from this report. And I think this is going to give us something to kind of talk about over time. Dave, we've already covered the first one, which is, 47% of the production data. Now, sometimes that's depending on who you talk to, the stat gets a little fuzzy. So let's be really clear. This is not about 47% of orgs or of servers or whatever. When organizations were specifically asked, thinking about your last ransomware event, what percentage of your production data was encrypted by the bad actors? Rough number is half.
Yeah.
Half, right?
Yeah, I like this data in the sense that it's actually proving that all the talk around ransomware cyber threats is warranted. It's justified. So when we think about that, I mean, availability wise, we're always planning for a 100% uptime, zero data loss. That, of course, from an engineering perspective is the goal. But what we're seeing is the results say 47% bricked or encrypted. And we've already talked through the frequency of ransomware events for the vast majority of us. These are just incredibly startling or sobering statistics. This is why we all need to do our part from a security perspective. Even if you're not in the security organization, we all play a role. Even if you're not in IT, you play a role, from phishing attacks to other kind of perimeter security concerns. 47% encrypted data, it is clearly unacceptable.
Yeah, and before we mention the other part of this, I should also point out again that all 1,000 organizations that were surveyed here, these were unbiased organizations. These are not Veeam customers. We don't even know who they were other than we set the criteria for size of organization, et cetera. And I bring that up in part because there's a couple internet trolls out there, ambulance chasers, whatever you want to do, that just keep saying, look, even Veeam can't restore their own data. These aren't Veeam customers. Chill out. Anyway, but yeah, on average, organizations that were hit last year said 69% of their data was recoverable, right? So, and simple math here, 47% of your data gets encrypted. You can get 69% of it back, which means you lose 31%. So running on that is right at 15% data loss, right? 15% of what was there doesn't come back in your environment. So as long as you picked the right 15% of your data not to protect, then you're good, right? But for everybody else, that equates to a bad day. And according to the stat on the last slide, more than one bad day per year at 15% each. That's pretty scary.
It's very scary. And if we look at the next column, what people actually did, mean that 52, 24, 19, I'll just jump to the bottom. The quote right answer, if you will, is the 19, the smallest of those three numbers. And why is it the right answer? Well, it's because roughly just under 1 out of 5 were able to recover without paying the ransom. This is what we should all be aspiring to, but this was not the majority. It was the smallest of the sample size that we got back, wasn't it?
Yeah, this chart we will absolutely be revisiting, and it's one of my favorite pie charts that came out of the entire research project. If I could sum up Veeam's entire mission statement for the rest of 2021, it would be to help the other 81% of cyber victims be able to answer the same way that bottom is. Instead of just 19, flip that over. How do we get the other 81% of people to say, no, I'm not going to pay. I'm going to restore. And I'm going to do it confidently, and I'm going to do it reliably. I'm going to restore. I'm not going to pay. But yeah, there's another part of this which is really quite startling. Take a look at the other two numbers. Now, you Dave, focus on the 19. I want to focus on that 24, which I'm going to say is like hunter safety orange, meaning that it's supposed to be dangerous. Here's the problem. If you add up 52 and 24, you get about 76%. So 3 out of 4 organizations did pay the ransom, right? But 24, roughly half of 52, a third of the folks that paid the ransom still could not recover, right? I mean, you paid you still couldn't get back. And some of our experts, I think Edwin Vejamina mentions this before, the idea that it's not like you pay your crypto Bitcoin, you get this magic incantation key, and everything just goes back to the way it was. It can take weeks to roll that back, and that's if you got it correct.
Yeah, and,
That's
and
super scary.
and it's not on your time frame, meaning you pay on the bad actor's time frame, on their time frame, assuming to your point, Jason, roughly 2 out of the 3 times you actually pay, you're going to get the key. Doesn't mean you instantly get the key too. So the
Right.
clock doesn't even start until the bad actors issue the key to you, which could take time anywhere from hours to potentially days. And then your point, 1/3 of the time you decided, okay, we're going to go down this path. We're going to populate a Bitcoin wallet. We're actually going to fund this. It still doesn't work out. For the math nerds out there, if you add up 52, 24, and 19, you're going to realize that's not 100%. The scary one to me, Jason, is that gives us 5% remaining. The 5%, folks, was no ransom was asked for. And the phrase I've been adopting is what that really says is the bad actors were into arson, not into extortion. They were just there to cause mayhem. 5%, I know that sounds small, but Jason, that's 1 out of 20 organizations. You don't want to be that one. 1 out of 20, we
Right.
just got inflicted with something. We don't even have the potential of hopefully, if we can't recover ourselves, paying a ransom and hopefully getting out of it. We're just stuck.
Yeah, that when you first said that, I I was actually minimizing. I was thinking like, it didn't count because they didn't pay. I had not realized, holy, 5% is arson. It's
Yeah.
not about ransom. It's arson. And yeah, absolutely. Huge point on that. Huge point. All right. So those were the stats that, to me, validated all the concern and all the media hype and all the awareness that's out there. Let's talk a little bit about some of the surprises
Yeah.
that came out of this, and surprises slash disappointments along the way. Uh, uh, let's start with that other one in orange, because this one's really scary to me, right? So 19% on the left said, hey, they were able to restore without paying. How do you have any confidence that you can restore if you're not testing your backups, Dave? That is absurd to me.
Yeah, that's really living dangerously, to put it mildly, because we've hopefully now proven to everyone, or proven to ourselves, that this is real. This is happening as often, or maybe even more often than we think. We hear it in the headlines a lot, but we've got the data now to back it up. It's not just anecdotal. And yet, in terms of having confidence that you can recover, it's very, very low. Our colleague Melissa Palmer likes to say ransomware is a disaster, but let's
Yep.
not trivialize other disasters as well. We have weather events around the globe. We have other kinds of concerns. We certainly still have failures in the data center, meaning components and patch changes. So the very fact that we're in the business of backup and recovery, and we don't actually know with not only certainty, but any kind of verification that we can actually restore, is hard to reconcile.
It really is. Now, by the way, so what you're seeing here is the stat that kind of grabbed our attention: 16% actually test, right? And when I mean actually test, mean that your backup product you actually restore, preferably through scheduling and automation, because who wants to do that manually every night, right? But you actually try to restore, and then did the server power up? Can you ping it? Can you mount to it? Can you ODBC? Can you MAPI? Can you do whatever it does, right? That's a test. The majority of organizations, this is obviously a minor minority, the majority, Dave, they're relying on the backup log, right? Or they're relying on read after write tests of the media. I can't think of how many 3-day weekends I have given up over my 30-year career because that was not a validation.
Yeah, I like to call that the return code zero, false sense of security. If for those of you that remember return codes, just because it comes back no error doesn't mean no problem. So, for example, let me give you the classic one. There was a problem in the way the policy or the job or whatever your solution may be got configured. So, zero return code error, but zero data backed up. So
Right.
that's the bad time to find out that you didn't actually back it up or protect it properly is when you need it. So speaking of issues that we've all encountered probably around the world, let's hit the map one more time because we do have some new entrants.
Oh,
Always like to see this. A couple new states in the United States. We've got Kentucky, Chicago and Illinois there, California also. And then looking globally, we've got Armenia that came in Europe.
nice.
And then if we look over in Africa, we've got Nigeria. And then in
Okay.
APJ, Asia Pacific Japan, we've got Nepal and Taiwan. So thank you for who knows what time of day, Jason, but I know it's probably well into the evening. So definitely thank you for that. Should just give a quick shout out too. Jason, you and I do these live in United States Monday morning time frame, and then we put it up there in our various channels, meaning the LinkedIn page, the YouTube channel, etc. And it persists until typically the next one. I mean, there's some of them are up there evergreen forever. But in a typical week, we'll see 1,000, 2,000 people sometimes still check these out after the fact. So thank you for that too. If you're one that's not viewing this live, shout out to you for that. So we've talked about a lot of bad numbers. We talked one good number, which is that 19%. We wish it was higher, but at
Right.
least 19%. Didn't pay the ransom, did get the data back. There, in my opinion, was one more good number, and that was that 46, which is a little shy of half, but 46% of the organization said, we pre-stage our recovery. And by pre-stage, we just mean they don't go directly into production. They do some validation prior to going back into the wild or into production. So they pre-stage recovery into an isolated sandbox. Veeam Quick Commercial, Veeam pioneered instant recovery. We
Sure.
call it data labs. And that notion is really just being able to ensure through inspection, again, not on taking chance, not on hope, but through proper validation that what you're bringing back will not reinfect the environment. I just can't give a shout out enough for that. Now, on the one hand, I'm super glad that that's at least approaching half,
Yep.
but I'm doubling down on this because if you're in that 54%, please consider doing this because you've lived pretty dangerously to this point. You don't want to reinfect after probably taking a long weekend, to Jason's point earlier, probably having to spend hours and sleepless nights trying to get this back, only to be back in a bad situation.
Yeah, let's be honest, that 54%. So if you didn't pre-stage, the other options that were available in that particular question were things like, okay, I restored the production environment, then I ran a scanner on it before the users got to it, or I just monitor. I mean, there was a couple options there that I was embarrassed for the folks that might have put them on there along the way. But let's be honest, it's hard.
Yeah.
Right? It's hard to do sandboxing. It's hard to if you restore something, whether it's for the test that happens in that 16% or the when you're scanning as part of the restore job, it's hard to set up a sandbox environment where you can get there through network proxies and firewalls. It's hard to restore into that because the backup job can only see the production environment as well. How do you also have it figure out how to restore to that sandbox? Then you got to get in that sandbox and play and make sure that it's clean or that it works or whatever. Both those numbers are actually the two sides of that same coin. It's hard, right?
Yeah.
Now, it's not hard if you're using Veeam Data Labs, if you're using instant recovery, but if you're using some other technologies, I get why they don't do it because it's really, really hard and complex to do. So, that's as close to a Veeam commercial as I'm going to get for this one. I would point out though that as part of this process, I can't count the number of times last week at VeeamON when I said ransomware is a disaster. We're not saying ransomware is the disaster, right? You mentioned that earlier. And when you think of all the orchestration necessary for any disaster recovery, it's the same run book every time. The only difference is when you talk about ransomware, you have to inject the process to ensure that what you are orchestrating for recovery is clean.
Right.
And so if you can automate those complex steps, make that part of your orchestration path, all of a sudden you too get to be part of that 19% that said you did not pay along the way. Dave, I know we're almost at time, but we have enough time to give you some of that good news in that upper right-hand corner of that right-hand
Yes.
side. Preach, my brother, preach it.
Yeah, let me get my finger right over my shoulder there. That little thing that the Veeam Bear is hugging is an LTO cartridge, that
There you
maroon
go.
dark object. Tape, I'll go to my grave being a tape apologist, not because I think it should be your medium of first choice, but it's a fantastic medium of last resort. And when it comes to cyber threats, last resort can sometimes be what keeps you in business. 45% of data stored on tape at some point during the life cycle. Tape actually truly can be air gapped, so shout out for that. We're seeing actually a resurgence of tape in the hyperscalers.
Yep.
Also, speaking of shout outs, Catronell was letting me know that Barbados, Germany, and Saudi Arabia also came in. So thank you all for that. As we look ahead, we're going to have, Jason, I would hazard a guess to say probably 5 more shows over the many upcoming weeks unpacking all this data. Again, this is 1,000 global organizations that were successfully, if we can use that term, infiltrated or attacked by ransomware, and the lessons that they learned and are sharing with us. Now, next week, this time is a U.S. holiday, so we'll be taking that off. But this coming Friday, our great friends Rick Vanover and Kirsten, I'm sorry, it's actually going to be Rick's team, Kirsten and Corinne, are going to be doing a recap of Veeam. I want to give a shout out to them because they were both demoing on main stage, which was a huge stage in Las Vegas, and they absolutely knocked it out of the park. So be sure to check that out. There, a lot of things in well, I guess it was 3 days, Jason, but they're going to net it out into about 30 minutes for everybody.
Yeah. If you have not had a chance to watch the general sessions on repeats from Veeam 1, both of them, K squared, can we use that as a term?
There you go.
They were fantastic. The demos told great stories, and they were the voices of them. I used to do that demo job. That's a scary job being in front of that many people, and back-to-back home runs for the two of them. So yeah.
And
in the meantime, though, we have a whole bunch of stuff planned for the next several weeks beyond the holidays, though.
That's right. And also we want to make a point to tell everyone, Veeam viewing that virtually is no charge. You can still sign up for that. I believe we're going to keep that content up for the next couple of months. So those main stage demos, they're not pre-recorded. They were actually live, kind of live without a net, if you will, meaning there was no backup plan and everything went off flawlessly. So check that out, and we'll be back with you probably week after next.
Yep.
Thanks so much for tuning in. Stay safe, stay positive, stay free from ransomware, and we'll see you next time. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be tuning in from. Jason and I are back after a little bit of a hiatus for Veeam, which we did as a hybrid event. Hybrid meaning, of course, virtual, but back in person for the first time in, well, a little while, let's put it that way. And then we had a U.S. holiday last Monday. So now we are back in the fold. Love to hear where you might be tuning in from. We've got a world map that we like to hit every now and then. You can see some green up there already. We have, in addition to all of our production staff, Jason's in Texas, I'm in Colorado, our producers in Georgia in the United States. But we also, I see, have New Hampshire in. Right. And if we look abroad in Europe, we've got a visitor from France already identifying in, and we've got production support in Romania as well. So shout out to that. Love to see where you're tuning in from. Also, feel free to post any questions. So without further ado, we started off a couple of weeks ago teeing up what's going to be a multi-part series around ransomware, some data that we've just recently published. It's not Veeam-specific data, it's industry-specific data. And Jason, as much as I'm like an optimist, glass half full, I'll just give a little disclaimer. There's some violent images that may appear, so sensitive children may be advised that this is not necessarily the most uplifting of data. However, it's something that I think is going to be important either because people can really learn from it, or you can take this personally to your manager, your team in the data center to say, look, here's some independent data that says we need to really address this. It's a law of numbers and they don't favor us. So I'll kick it over to you, Jason, because we've got a couple of different research projects we're going to draw from to bring in data to make this point.
Yeah, and I just reiterate what you said earlier. So there's nothing good that's going to come out of this particular first set of data. So this week we're going to explore the scope of the problem. Right, we're going to see how bad this is, and I think your guidance so far is exactly spot on, Dave. And that is that please send this link to your cybersecurity buddy, to your IT director or IT VP along the way, because we're going to cover this 5-part landscape. And the first part really is looking at how pervasive is the problem of ransomware from a realistic point of view. Point out to you that both the data sets that we're going to use today are unbiased. This was blind research, not Veeam customers, not Veeam partners. We have no idea other than the demographics as to where these are. And let's start off with our first data point, because this is actually what got our attention. Now, some of you who've been following the research for a while, you're going to recognize this. This is one of the most common points that came out of our data protection trends research, which published back in February of this year. And in that research, every year for the last 3 or 4 years, Veeam has published the results of this DPR study, largest of its kind, nearly 3,400 respondents, 28 countries, almost all enterprises around the world. And one of the new areas that was tested for DPR 2022 was around cyber attacks. And so the question that was originally asked was, how many times has your organization been attacked by ransomware in the prior 12 months? And you see here that 24%, 1 in 4 organizations said they had not. We'll double back on that in a second. 16%, so 1 in 6, said they've been hit 1 time. And then that means 60%. 3 out of 5 organizations had been hit 2 or more times over the year. But Dave, before we get into the rest of the data set, you and Danny have kind of really pounded on our CTO, really pound on that 24% being perhaps overly optimistic. Walk us through that, and then we'll pivot into the new data.
Yeah, so that 24% or roughly 1 out of 4, those are bad odds to begin with, meaning obviously roughly 75%, 3 out of 4 got hit. And to your point, when they got hit, the highest concentration points where they got hit 2 times or 3 times in a 12-month period. But here's the decomposition of why that 24% needs to be perhaps taken with a little bit of grain of salt, meaning what happened was the person, the individual responding to this survey in a large enterprise, as you pointed out, Jason, it's possible that that individual just did not have visibility or awareness of a cyber infiltration in their business. So that is not to conclusively say that 24% of all businesses globally were immune. It just means that of the sample that we got, the person that responded actually just may not have had visibility. So don't take that 24% to the bank. The odds are probably far lower because no one ever jumps around and tells even internally, hey, we got hit, we got hit. There's a certain kind of quietness that goes along with a successful infiltration.
Well, and when you think about it, certainly also from a quietness perspective, we're seeing more and more cases where the bad actor has gotten access to the environment, and they can actually free roam in that environment up to 200 days on average prior to actually asking for that ransom event, right? So this can be for many a waiting game. So it's certainly arguable there's a good portion of that orange 24%. Some of them are naive. Others are unaware of the fact that someone's actually lurking out there, navigating through the system. They just haven't declared yet, right? And then, yeah, there's a portion who have not been hit yet. All right, so this data got our attention, right? And this is from the Data Protection Trends Report. And so we said, okay, let's double down. Let's go really find this out. So we surveyed a second group. We didn't survey. An independent firm of Anson Bourne went off and did the survey. And one of the things that they did was they said, okay, we're going to go and look at another 1,000 organizations. 9 different countries around the world. But in this case, instead of being completely unbiased, everyone had to have had been hit by ransomware at least once because we wanted to learn from actual victims. So we doubled down on that study. Let's take a look at some of that. So this is now looking at the ransomware survey, and you can see the URL in the upper right-hand corner. Please download the data. In fact, all the charts are available. You're welcome to use those as you see fit. Also, our good friend Chris Hoff wrote a blog post earlier this morning on Veeam.com, kind of outlining some of these same tenets and his take on those as well. Dave, when you and I talk about the data protection trends report from earlier, we talk about, the 2 most common causes of outages are bad humans and silly humans.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to argue this data is saying almost the same thing, only combining all the poor choices that humans make into one glorious link on the top of the screen.
Yeah, and if you just glance at the percentages, you very quickly see that they total up to more than 100%. So there's multiple different entree points at play simultaneously for many organizations. And if you just look over on the verbiage on the left-hand side, number of different ways or entree points. And this is what makes ransomware very nefarious. Besides the long dwell time that you mentioned, there's a lot of ways to try to get as broad of a net as possible for somebody to do something that maybe they shouldn't.
Yeah. We talk about, bad actors being the number 1 cause, silly actors being the number 2. In this case, we've got silly actors clicking on links caused by bad actors, right? So, I mean, this is very definitely more a human problem in the top choice. I also think it's interesting that the second and third choices, this comes down to, let's call it a different category, silly admins. Right. Folks who are not proactively testing the patches and they're aware of the supply chains that are there, or they've or credential compromise, putting an at instead of an A and dollar signs instead of the S when you say password. Turns out that's not as secure as you think. And folks are getting bit by that. So, Dave, before we kind of get more into this landscape, how's the map looking?
Yeah, let's do a quick hit over there because we've actually had a lot of activity. Canada, as you can see, jumps up. So that always lights quite a bit green. In the United States, in addition to New Hampshire, Colorado, Georgia, more people joining from Texas, Nevada, Indiana, and Illinois. And if we look over across the pond, shall we say, we've got France, Holland, Spain joining some of the other countries that were already in there. And then we also see Cameroon, Morocco, United Emirates, and India. So shout out to all of that. Please keep everything coming in terms of where you might be tuning in from, and feel free to post any comments or questions. Again, a quick commercial. Definitely encourage you to download this resource. I always like to say again and again, you owe it to yourself to get educated and informed. All you have to do is go to VEE.am/RW22. That just means ransomware 22 to check out the research. So let's keep going on. I will call it the news. I won't give it an attribution, favorable or unfavorable.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Is we just going to explain the information to people, let them make up their own minds, unlike other news networks that might be out there. All right, so let's do a little myth busting. One of the questions that we wanted to really understand in the research was, what does the attack surface look like? You just covered the geographic map. Let's look at the cyber map of choice. And so, and in fact, this question actually came from our CTO, Danny Allen, and he wanted to know, okay, so where are people getting in from, right? So you could make the hypothesis that remote office, branch office, retail, the edge, however you want to describe that. Usually that doesn't have quite as much mature IT technology out on that edge because you got, 200 branch offices, 60 locations, whatever that landscape is. So maybe robo is the dangerous place where stuff is first coming in from. And then there'll be other people out there that say, yeah, I can lock down my data center. I have a hard time locking down the cloud. Right? Surely, maybe that's where the attack surface is coming from. Turns out neither one of those is true. So what you see here is 3 bell curves. The reason for the bell curve is because one of the things that makes this research interesting, and again, go to that URL that Dave showed you earlier, is we surveyed specifically 4 different personas on the same questions to kind of understand where do they agree and disagree. And so you see that same bell curve of IT operations generalists, right? They're the folks they're the ones who get the call when stuff goes bad. We got the backup admins. They're the ones who are going to try to put it back together again, right? When Humpty Dumpty falls off the wall. We have the security professionals. They're in charge of prevention and then certainly a partner in the remediation process. And then CISOs, right? Executives who are top line responsible for ensuring the survivability of the organization. And when you look at this bell curve, Dave, geography and the real estate actually doesn't seem to apply, but I think it's interesting. The backup admins and the security professionals, they mostly agree with each other, and they don't agree as much with those that are a little further from the problem. What did you see when you saw through this?
Yeah, actually it's a kind of a concerning notion of the more you know, the more you're concerned about or more you're afraid. So the further away you remove, the further that the actual threatscape might be from your cognition. And unfortunately, those that live and die in the trenches and are very responsible for this, meaning the frontline people, they're very concerned. And to your point, the concern is broad-based. And this is the notion that we saw in the Data Protection Trends Report in terms of what can take down a server, meaning unplanned downtime. Similar notion here. It's not, hey, let's just rally the data center and go fix one thing. And it's not just, oh, there's only one entree point. There's only one kind of threat that we need to worry about. It's very pervasive. We've used the phrase in the past, this is a bit like a fisherman just throwing the net out into the sea. This is the nature of cyber threats. It's basically a crime of opportunity. It's a game of numbers, but the numbers don't favor the data center or even the remote office, the cloud hosted data.
They really don't. They really don't. Now again, I mean, you see the curve and in the shape of the data. Let's be clear. So you're looking at on the low point 39%, on the highest point 56. Split the difference. You're really at 46 plus or minus 4. So roughly 46% of the infections come in from one of those 3 sources along the way. It's how it's distributed out along the way. The thing that I think you should take away from this is recognize that when you take a survey like this, you're in the survey for 20 or 30 minutes. It's not like the respondent in the survey said, oh, let me go back and look at my logs and see exactly how many percent this. It's not how this works, right? This is a perception and sentiment study. And so the reason that's important is because what you see is that those folks that are closest to remediation or closest to actually having to solve for the problem, right? The backup admin reactively, the security professional proactively, they're remembering at a higher rate, right? And all that really tells you is that the rest of us, memories fade, right? The IT operations folk, oh yeah, we had those bad months and we had a couple bad days and memory fades. The problem is that when your memory fades, all of a sudden your appetite for how do you prevent the next one becomes diminished, right? So this is where you really got to lean into those folks who live and breathe security day in and day out. Our friend Chris Hoff is like that, right? I mean, we pay him to be a pessimist, to tell us how bad things are going to be, because chances are, according to this data, he's more right than the rest of us.
Yeah, we've seen this trend before. I'll call it inavailability in general, meaning in disaster recovery and backup and recovery, you think of, let's call it weather-related events, a tsunami, a hurricane, an earthquake, what have you. The interest in disaster recovery or the interest in protecting data and securing it, making it available, spikes after one of those events. And unfortunately can wane over time. To your point, Jason, there is a recency bias. Part of the reason that we're basically doubling down on less than optimistic news here is to kind of scare everyone straight in the notion of, hey, don't take this as we can ride this out, right? We can play the odds. The odds are already bad. We're trying to assert that actually the odds are even potentially worse than what some of the data may suggest as well. So only one more bad slide, Jason. Let's tee that up.
Yeah, here's the punchline, right? We've talked about how that most organizations have been hit, are going to be hit. We talked about how there is no safe area of the real estate. So let's punchline this now. Once they're in, here's the rest of the bad news. So organizations were asked, what percentage of the organization's production data do you estimate the ransomware attack successfully encrypted? Right. So production data, not just anything that might be fringed out there. And this was successfully encrypted. Now, we could just have a big, nasty 47% number. It takes over the whole page, and that'd be interesting. But then you'd have to wonder about, hey, maybe just a few bad cases really skews the averages. And that's just not true. Right. So the edge cases, if you want to talk about the extremes, on the edges, on the far left, 5% said no data was successfully encrypted. Now, if you have a successful attack and you have no data successfully encrypted, that probably means you had a disclosure problem. They were going for disclosure to the outside world as opposed to encryption. So that's a whole different kind of ugly right there. On the right-hand side, 3%, almost even money, said they got it all. Done. Everything was successfully encrypted. And then you see this pretty easy belt spread that goes across the way. But the bottom line, if you're taking notes, write this down. 47%. Half of your data has now gone through a meat grinder.
Yeah. So, what this means, let's put a finer point on that. What this really means is production's gone. And you're relying on your secondary copy, as we all do in a disaster of some kind. And ransomware is a disaster, as our colleague Melissa Palmer always likes to point out.
Yes.
You take out the outliers. 5% said none of the data got affected. I'll even take the other two right-hand side, meaning 91 to 99% or all of the data, 100%. That added up to 6. You add both of those outliers up, we'll call it, Jason, that's 11%. 89% had pretty heavy hits in there, with the most popular, highly concentrated areas being 31 to 40% of the data or 71 to 80% of your data. Any way you look at it, basically coin flip, almost 50% of the data on average was encrypted. You lost primary. You can only get back maybe half of your secondary. And that just, Jason, assumes that everything goes well. Right. That 53% says it wasn't encrypted. However, we still have to successfully recover it and put it back into production. So that's a best case scenario of that 53% unencrypted. Doesn't mean it was brought back and made available.
Right. But also think about this, right? So when the attack actually happens, you don't know what all is encrypted. I mean, you know the stuff that is successfully encrypted. You don't know what else is also exposed that you just haven't touched yet. Right. So certainly what happens in a lot of cases is yellow tape goes across that entire server rack, not just the 47% of drives that are encrypted, but how about the others? We were talking right before the call started about COVID and hey, I was positive. My wife was in quarantine down the hall. I mean, that's what happens to your data, too, along that way. So do not underestimate. The entire environment gets impacted. It's just the 47% that you have to pull back through that meat grinder again before it's usable. All right. So as we said, there is no good news this week. Before we kind of wrap up, though, and tell you what's coming next, Dave, there's some new countries hit the map. It looks like, in fact, including a few of my favorites.
Yeah, so United States, we've got New Mexico that's come in as well, and we look over.
I've been watching New Mexico lately because my beloved Philmont Scout Ranch has been under fire lately with the forest fires, so watching them pretty close.
Yeah, unfortunately, it is fire season in a lot of areas in the United States, West Coast or Western area. And if we look out across the way, Slovakia actually just came now, United Kingdom. Many joining from India. So obviously this is a topic resonating there. Iraq also came in. It's been a while since we've seen Iraq, Jason. So shout out to that area. And of course, Slovakia, that's been quite a while, I believe. So huge shout out to that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Please keep your questions coming in. Please keep your chiming in. We continue to watch and welcome folks even for the whole 7 days of the replay along the way.
Yeah.
So this is week one, and Dave, I know you're going to take us through what's coming on Friday, but just to let you know, we're not going to spend 5 weeks on bad news. Right? This week was all about how pervasive is the problem. We're going to look next week at the first days after ransomware really strikes, right? So where does the ransom come from? Did the ransom get paid? Was it effective? How do you turn that meat grinder around in reverse and start getting that data back? We're going to look at that starting next week. And then this is a 5-part series. But Dave, our friends are going to do some stuff on Friday prior, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So coming up this Friday, our colleague David Hill is going to host a Friday Tech Bite on how to manage your data in a multi-cloud world. That'll be same time, 12 p.m. United States Eastern Time, 6 p.m. CET. And then on Monday, as you pointed out, Jason, we're going to hit back again the next segment of our ransomware 22 findings. The whole purpose of this one, as maybe non-inspiring as it may be, is really just to lay the foundation for why an organization should take this seriously. Unfortunately, highly non-discriminate. Now, Jason, there are examples of state-sponsored events or
Sure.
corporate targeted entities that are basically selected for who and what they are, maybe their vertical, their size, their geography, whatever. However, the vast majority of cyber threats, again, a crime of opportunity, it does not discriminate against what kind of business you're in, what kind of size of business you're in, your geographical location, et cetera. This is what makes this very nefarious and concerning. The trick I always like to say is in the past, when we dealt with availability, there was two things going on. Random bad things might happen, and that typically meant that we would restore 3 to 5% of the data that we backed up. The catch was you didn't know which 3 to 5% in a 12-month period. And of course, you didn't know which day or when that might happen. The flip side was, while there could be something that was very much unexpected, to your point about fires, there's other things that we get an early warning indicator.
Right.
Maybe it's certain weather-related events or instability of some kind from civil unrest that we get this notion of let's get prepared. Ransomware just strikes often without warning. To your point earlier, Jason, often with hundreds of days, over 200 days of dwell time. So when it hits hard. It goes far beyond that 3 to 5% of data. It literally could be 100% of your data. The attack surface could be absolutely everything. Oh, we do have a question that came in too. I want to make sure we get to that. So Mitch asks, rather than relying on backups along with the delays, what's your best strategy to proactively avoid ransomware? I'll give you one, and Jason, you give one as well. If we go back to just referencing your causality slide, one of the best things you can do is, I call it, I'll put this in the category of digital hygiene. And that is number 2 here at 41%, infected patch software packaging, et cetera. In other words, if you are current on your good hygiene, patching your systems, your operating systems, your applications, your middleware, even going so far as to say, where does it make sense going into that next one? Can we turn off RDP where we don't need it? Things that we ideally would have been doing for some time, just that alone can reduce the aperture of the attack window.
Yeah, in fact, actually, it's not actually on this particular slide, but there's a different slide that we actually did get from the same data. In fact, if it is in the deck. So if you go to vee.am/RW22, Mitch, it's a fantastic question. One of the things that's actually in that data set they'll tell you is that only 20% of the infected systems were opportunistic, meaning that the other 80% took advantage of either a known vulnerability in the hypervisor, in the OS, right? So certainly proactive patch mitigation is a huge part, right? Think about it this way. There seems to be, in general, on opportunistic attacks, not including state-sponsored or targeted, There seems to be two stages. The first stage is, how did you first get that first entry point into the system? And as you can see on the data points on your right-hand side, for a vast majority, somebody clicked a link, right? So user education is paramount. Secure tools that actually monitor your email systems when you don't. I forget how long it's been now, but Veeam gets an email to me every day that says, hey, the following emails were removed because they were just suspect. Tell me if I should actually restore them back in. So those kinds of proactive scrub tools and not just relying on smarter users, that's a big deal. That said, once they're in, then the bad actor says, hey, I got a hit. I made it through the first rung, right? Then 80% are taking advantage of a known vulnerability. So proactive patching of those mainstream platforms, the hypervisors, the OSs, et cetera, big deal. That's it from there.
Yeah, one quick comment before we sign off. Lewis from Palo Alto Networks comes in and says, is Veeam looking at way to harden backup repositories and proxies out of the box in the future to ensure backups readily available for restore and ransomware scenario? Yes, there's a number of things that we do there. So in addition to offering a no charge, meaning we're not in the business of selling you proprietary hardware, but we can, through no charge, set up a Linux repository on the distribution of your choice, hardware of your choice. We also have an ecosystem of great partners that offer hardened solutions right off the bat. And then for over half a decade now, we've offered insider protection through our service provider partners as well. So a number of different avenues there. And behind me, let's see if I can find it, basically just over there, my friend LTO tape. Tape continues to be a great way as well. The thing I always like to point out, though, and I like to comment about readily available for restore. Veeam pioneered instant recovery. We've got the patent on that. Unlike some of the appliance vendors where really it has to be a cache hit, meaning it better be the most recent backup and on solid state disk. Veeam has a number of prefetching advanced algorithms to even bring back from deduplicated disk, rehydrate that very, very fast. So what that means is you can recover at scale, or you can recover smaller number of machines extremely rapidly. Again, not infrastructure dependent. We're all about choice. So I'll leave it there for that. And just shout out, encourage you to download the report. Again, it is industry specific, not vendor specific. So it is representative of global large enterprises that actually, to Jason's point, did get hit. These are basically the tales from those that lived to tell after experiencing it. You owe it to yourself to get educated. Check out Friday's Tech Bites with David on multi-cloud, and check out the next series on ransomware decomposition of this research next Monday. Thanks for tuning in. Stay safe, stay positive, and we'll see you on the next live stream. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be joining us from. Welcome to another episode of Industry Insights. Jason is off this week. He's actually camping with several hundred Boy Scouts in the middle of nowhere, quite literally. So very pleased to be joined by Chris Hoff. Chris is our Global Security Marketing Specialist. Chris, thanks so much for jumping in today.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So speaking of dropping in, love to hear where you may be tuning in from. We've got a global map that we populate when all you have to do is whichever of the different platforms you might be viewing us on, just drop a comment in to say where you're tuning in from. I'm in Colorado. We've got production assistants in Texas and in Georgia. Chris is joining from Massachusetts area, and feel free to drop in any questions, comments, and of course your locale. And we'll revisit the map a couple times throughout the live stream. So today what we're doing is continuing a multi-episode, or actually Jason and I concluded last week, we're probably going to have 7 different episodes in a series on our ransomware research that we released just concurrent with Veeam a couple of weeks ago. It's the Ransomware Trends Report. And we'll drop in from time to time the URL for that link. I encourage you to check it out. It is not a Veeam commercial. Chris can attest to that. This is an industry level research. So we're not talking just about Veeam users, Veeam customers, Veeam products. It is the state of ransomware in the industry. And Chris, one of the things I like about this research is it's 1,000 organizations, it's 1,000 different people, but it's not just any old people. It's people that actually got hit with ransomware and the stories that, if you will, they live to tell.
It's fantastic from a research perspective. I wouldn't want to be one of those 1,000 people, but it's great that we were able to talk to these people and find out what it's really like to live through a ransomware incident.
Yeah, absolutely. And so without further ado, let's take a look at our first data point. And the first few slides here, Jason came up with the title, which I liked, and it's basically follow the money. And, Chris, we're looking at how did an organization actually pay, if they did pay for the ransom? And you can see that the majority, nearly half, paid through some sort of cyber-specific insurance coverage. And I want to pause on that and tee this up to you because I know you and Jeff Reichart on our team in particular have been looking at cybersecurity and the insurance aspect of this. And I believe there's been some changes there, meaning it's more difficult to get successful cyber insurance payouts now.
There definitely is. And, it's been coming for a while. When we first started with cyber insurance, there was this thought, generally speaking, that it was an easy button and you could just get your insurance and not have to worry about it. But then obviously insurance companies are in business to make money.
Yeah.
So they started putting kind of boxes around what they would pay out on. And what we're starting to see more and more is that if you're not following a specific set of standards, whether it's NIST or something else, depending on your industry, you're not going to get a payout, or you're not going to get help when an incident happens. And it's also interesting to know that these companies that are getting their insurance payouts, they're just like when you get into a car accident, your rates are going to go up. And so it's becoming even more cost prohibitive to have cyber insurance, even though it is almost a requirement these days for doing business.
Yeah. And if we look at that, this next highest, nearly half at 47% said they paid through cyber-specific insurance. 1 out of 4, 25% said they paid through some other kind of insurance. So to your point, Chris, 72%, better than 7 out of 10, are saying that they've used some method of insurance to pay off the bad actors. Obviously, to your point, they're in it to make money, meaning the insurance companies, it affects premiums, it affects the qualifications that you have to go through. And if we look at the next build out here, does your organization currently have a cyber insurance policy? The vast majority do to some degree. 57% said yes, and it's inclusive of ransomware. 30% said yes, but ransomware is excluded. And 11% said no, but they're actively looking for cyber insurance. I want to toss it back to you, Chris, because if you're in that 11% that may be looking for cyber insurance, the landscape, to your point or your last comments, has shifted slightly now.
Absolutely. And, it's, like I said, it's becoming harder and harder to get, I'll call it full coverage for cyber insurance. And that 11% is really having to dig deep into what they're really trying to protect, as well as what their real threats are, in order to come up with a good policy that they can afford and will be useful for them. And what's interesting too is that the organizations, that 30% of organizations said yes, they have insurance, but it's not covering ransomware. In a lot of cases, the reason for that is that there is usually a terrorism clause in your insurance policy. And insurance companies are looking at ransomware because it's coming from state actors. They're looking at it as a terrorist event. And so they're choosing essentially not to pay because of that. And let's face it, with the executive order from the White House, there's possibly consequences if they were to pay a bad actor who's from a country that we have some uh, uh, issues with.
Yep, great point. And let's hit the map really quickly because we had a lot of activity come in. I'm just looking off, and the production team has been updating. Canada, of course, that covers a lot of real estate right there, so that lights up a good part of the country. We've had, let's see, if I go around the whole area of Puerto Rico, Canada, Mexico. We've also got Spain, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and we've got Colombia, Angola, United Emirates, Oman. Oman might be a first one or one that we haven't seen in quite some time. India, Bangladesh, and Angola. I did mention Angola. Good. And shout out to everyone. Thanks for very much for chiming in. Continue, please, if you haven't already dropped in a comment. Love to see where you might be tuning in from. So, Chris, if I go back to another slide now, one of the things we like to point out is the old phrase, time does cost money. And we asked, how long after the attack was your organization able to start restoring data from the backups? The vast majority at 55% said it took between 2 and 4 hours. But if you look a little closer to the right-hand side, you start to get into days. You've actually got nearly almost 30%. It's 28% said it was 1 to 2 days or even 3 to 4 days. And you just think about downtime, Chris, even in your own life, if you had to be without your data or connectivity for 4 days, and that's when you start recovering. Doesn't mean you're back up and running. The impact that might actually equate to.
And that's huge. And you all did that, the research from the data protection report that said that, what was it, $88,000 an hour was the average cost for downtime.
Yeah.
I mean, you're really starting to talk about real money. And, I don't know a lot of organizations that have that kind of cash on hand. So yeah, you have to assume that there's conversations going on about, what can we cut in order to survive this type of an incident.
Yeah, great point. And and when you think about that now in context, how long did the entire remediation recovery take before the organization essentially said the event is over? Most typical response at a third was 1 to 2 weeks or roughly half a month. But you can see as you go further to the right there, you get into multiple months. And it's not a very good news picture, especially the furthest right-hand side. 15% say it took anywhere from 1 to 4 months before they thought the incident was fully resolved. And I want to launch right into the next slide because you have to assume during multiple months, obviously the IT, the department, the data center has done everything they possibly can. They've brought in experts if they could. They've contacted their vendors. But the challenge is that there are third parties, but that could add to cost and delays in actually getting the systems back up. So if you look through just some of the different teams in here, Chris, I'd love to get your take on law enforcement because while that's important to some degree, they're operating on a different time schedule, as is potentially the one right under there. The ransomware negotiator may be optimizing for payment versus for getting the system back up and running.
Absolutely. And to your point, one of the things that's important to take away from this is that none of these conversations are technical in nature. It's not about none of this is about getting, actually restoring data. It's the business end of the attack. And when the ransomware negotiators, the specialists for forensics, a lot of those folks are now being required by your insurance providers, and so you have to have that type of service on hand just in case something goes wrong. When it comes to law enforcement, my experience is that they're going to do whatever it takes to solve the crime. And so getting you back up and running is not their priority, but also understanding the full scope of the crime is. And the reason that I bring that up is that you may have a single rack of servers or a single row in your data center that's been affected by ransomware, but they could very well shut down the entire data center and quarantine that off simply because they're collecting evidence and they want to make sure that they get all the evidence. And I can't imagine what it would be like to, know that you've essentially contained the problem, but now you've lost the access to your entire data center. It's kind of like having an ant problem in your kitchen and then not being able to go into your house for a couple of weeks.
Yeah, you're right. There are these side effects, and while it's a little bit different, it does remind me of a story back when I was an industry analyst where the government came in and literally just yanked out server disk racks. And the reason why was not anything to do with the one company, but they were commingling or co-hosting with others at an offsite data center. And there was literally dozens of companies that weren't really line of sight of what the government was targeting. But that was not what the organization, in this case, a government branch, was interested in. They were interested in understanding the nature of a bad actor or bad intention or suspected one anyway. And others were literally just caught up in the damage associated with that. So to your point, even data that is clean could get basically, as a side effect, hit with now an outage that actually made this situation from an IT perspective worse. It increased actually the surface of what was actually deemed vulnerable.
Absolutely. That's why we call it the blast radius, right?
Yes, good point, right? So it is very real in this regard. So we actually issued a poll, and as of about 15 minutes ago, we had just over 400 people vote on it. And this is a little bit of a tease because in a couple of weeks, we're going to actually double click on this particular data point. However, just wanted to get people's reaction to the question, what percentage of time did the bad actors from this research succeed in partially or completely modifying, deleting the backup repository? Chris, any guesses on your end?
I'm going to go with 59%.
You're close. It's actually 68. And how we got to 68 is 30%, according to our research, said, yes, they impacted most or all of our backup repositories. And 38% said some of the backups were impacted. So adding those up, 68%, there was some level of impact. So now what you've got is bad actors very quickly waking up to the notion that backup is a line of remediation against them getting paid, and they're specifically going after the repositories when they can.
And it's an ROI calculation for them,
Yes.
right? I mean, they're really trying to figure out how to maximize their investment.
It's really very interesting. Yeah, it's kind of a spooky world. I mean, the notion that there are ransomware negotiators on both sides of this who literally could be independent parties, meaning they're not associated with your company and they're not actually associated with the bad actors other than they've been hired on their behalf. So you've now got this essentially an ecosystem around something as nefarious as cybercrime that has sprung up in regards to trying to help organizations and bad actors navigate through this journey. And speaking of that, now if we switch gears, got a few slides on the ransom and the payment of it and what actually happens. And, I'm going to take a few different cuts of this data, Chris, but, I always like to joke, what's the right answer on here? The right answer is actually one of the smaller numbers, meaning, at 19%, only 1 out of 5 said that they were able to recover data and didn't have to pay the ransom.
And that number's that number's far too small.
Yeah.
But it's not surprising. And when you think about the way that the bad actors are going after your data these days, right? They're taking away your access to, or trying to take away your access to your backups. They're they're changing in some cases the way that your network is segmented. There's a lot of different things that they're doing that's forcing you down a path that is in line with that 52% who are paying the ransom. Although I will call out the 24% who paid the ransom and didn't get their data back. That number, I'm actually surprised that's not bigger, because when you think about the business that these organizations are in, it's about encrypting your data, or even now going back to old school, stealing your data and collecting money. It's not about decrypting the data and getting you back up and running. So they're not putting the QA resources into the decryptor or the tools to get you back up and running. So it's a pretty good bet that, you know, they're sending you the wrong decryption key. The tool itself is just, you know, not working correctly, or it was never intended to work in the first place.
Yeah, that is pretty shocking, really. And if I kind of put a little lens on that with the next chart here, you know, 76% paid the ransom, and 1 out of 4, you know, they paid, but they didn't get what they paid for, quite literally. And, you know, it's interesting because if you think about this from like a hostage, a human perspective, in all the crime movies you see, it's considered bad for business if you don't pay, or rather you do get paid and you don't return, you know, the kidnapped person unharmed, or agree to whatever the bargain was. If you don't live up to that, in this case, there's really no recourse. And to your point, Chris, right from the beginning, there could never have been possibly any intention of living up to the agreement once it was put in place, despite having, quote unquote, a negotiator involved in making this seem like a semi-legitimate business transaction. But there might have been bad intentions along the way. And towards that end, I like to just point out, if I build out one more time, go back to the original screen, look at that 5% at the top, Chris. No ransom was asked for. And the phrase I like to use here is, this is more like arson, not extortion, right? Someone didn't even make any bones about it. They were just there to inflict harm.
And it's interesting because, you know, you can read a lot into that 5%. You're absolutely right. It could very well just be arson. And, you know, the reason behind that could be that, you know, a competing entity was involved with that attack, trying to take a competitor out of the game, as it were. Interestingly, I had a conversation about this when these stats came out with a friend of mine who's a malware researcher, and he was assuming, and again, it's a little bit of an assumption, but he was assuming that the ransomware failed because something got in the way, you know, whether it's, you know, a firewall finally caught up and blocked communication, or, you know, segmentation kicked in, what have you. And something in your network actually caused the ransomware to fail partway through its process. So there's a lot of reasons that 5% could be there, and none of them are good.
Yeah. And, you know, I know you look at this, it's easy to say, well, 5%, that's a small number. But bear in mind, that's 1 out of 20 organizations. And this was a sample size of 1,000, right? So you don't want to be one of those 1 out of 20 where you just absolutely got hit. You didn't even go through the process of, you know, engaging in a discussion about, can we pay or not? Can I even obtain a decryption key? You literally just got attacked. And so the problem I see with all this is the numbers are really unfavorable from a percentage perspective. And Chris, would you agree? I've just only recently heard this phrase, but the reason that we're spending a lot of time and now going to do multi-part series on ransomware is that this is a crime of opportunity that really oftentimes, to your point, it could be a targeted attack from time to time, but most often it is just something that's completely independent of who you are as an organization, what kind of vertical you're in, what country you do business in. In other words, it's completely randomized and indiscriminate.
It absolutely is. And you know, I think of it as ransomware has essentially democratized data theft. And what I mean by that is that in the old days, you as the victim had to have something that the bad guy could monetize, right? Whether it's PII, credit card numbers, what have you. In the case of ransomware, the data only has to be valuable to you in order for you to be willing to pay to get it back. And so that means that anybody is a potential victim these days. And you're right, they don't have to be prescriptive about what they're doing, because whether you're a Fortune 100 corporation or you're somebody's grandmother, you're still probably going to be willing to pay to get some, if not all, of your data back.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I want to go back to the map really quickly because I think we had a couple large geographies come in. Australia, yep. So we've got Australia, we've got Austria as well that's also come in. So thank you very much for joining us on that. Encourage you, if you have any comments or questions, or if you haven't yet given us a shout out where you might be tuning in from, please feel free to do so. Also want to do just a quick reminder of where you can go and download this entire report. It is at VEE.am/RW22. RW just is short for ransomware 2022. VEE.am/RW22. Of course, I always like to use the phrase, and I do this a lot with our data protection trends report, you owe it to yourself to go get educated. You know, just go see the data, in part because it could help you if you're a data center professional. Go make the case to management about why this needs to be taken seriously. If you want to think about this as a law of numbers or averages, they don't favor you.
They absolutely don't. And you're right that this is data that can be used to justify your expenditures, or even look at what your, I'll call it security maturity levels are inside the organization, and put together a program to improve them and start being more proactive about your security.
Yep, great point. Great point. Well, as we start to wind down and look ahead, coming up this Friday, our colleagues Melissa Palmer and Kirsten Stoner, I love this title, Chris. They're going to have a Friday Tech Bite on 6 reasons why we both love and hate the public cloud. So,
that's awesome.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Be sure to check that out. Now, 1 week from today on the 20th is actually a U.S. holiday, so we won't have a live stream then. But the following Monday, 2 weeks from today on the 27th, Jason will be back. We'll be looking at now some of the answers or the technologies involved with how you can get into that 19% that didn't pay the ransom and did get your data back. I'll go with a little bit of a Veeam commercial there, Chris. We are very much in the business of wanting to make sure that you're in that 19% and holistically increasing that 19%.
Absolutely. And that's why that 19% is Veeam green.
That is no accident. You are right on that. And I can thank Jason for that. He actually hit the color coding wheel on that one to make sure that we aligned with that. I just hearing that I was going to see if anything else came in. Looks like we're clean. Chris, thank you so much for joining us. Encourage everyone to go check out the report. Be sure to check out this Friday about the good and the bad, if you will, on the public cloud. And we will see you here 2 weeks from today. We're going to start dissecting some of the technology answers so that you can get a better handle on your cybersecurity maturity. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be tuning in from. Welcome to episode 96, Jason, of Industry Insights. We are continuing our long-running series on ransomware. You may remember that at Veeam, we issued just a couple of weeks ago, maybe we're getting closer to a month now, Jason, yep. A special research project around ransomware. Was independent. It wasn't just Veeam customers. It was industry-wide, right, Jason, of 1,000 organizations that actually got compromised by ransomware. We've been detailing some of the lessons learned. But Jason, we want to invite everyone to give a shout out where you might be tuning in from. Please put that in the comment section. We've pre-populated where Jason is in Texas. I am in Colorado. We've got production taking place in Georgia as well as overseas in Romania. And I see that we've already got Ohio that's tuned in as well. And thank you to our Veeam team. Thank you for those that have already chimed in. Be sure to put any questions, comments, or just give us a shout out where you might be tuning in from. So, Jason, we feel like the last several episodes, we've basically gone a bit glass half empty, if you will, meaning we've described some of the dangers, some of the issues associated with it. We're just going to do a quick touch on that, and then we're going to turn it around and talk about some of the positives, some ways or strategies, techniques that you can actually think about how to put yourself in a better position to remediate against ransomware.
Yeah, so let's kind of wrap up the doom and gloom with these last data points. So this actually comes from two different research projects that were published in 2022. The first one is certainly from our flagship, the Data Protection Trends Report. Nearly 3,400 unbiased responses. Again, not Veeam customers. This is a blind panel run by a research firm named Vance and Bourne. In that project, 3,400 folks were asked, what percentage of your data could you get back after a ransomware attack? And on average, it's about 64%, if we can kind of go that first slide. So that's from the Data Protection Trends Report. We followed up on Data Protection Trends and said, let's go really understand and quantify the ransomware problems. We went off to another 1,000 organizations, in this case, all of whom, as you mentioned, have had a ransomware attack. And we find out something similar. They said 69% of their data is recovered. That doesn't include, by the way, the 11% that couldn't even try, right? So in fact, if you take 64 and 69, blend it together, let's just say the problem is roughly around 66 and a half, 66 and 2/3. So our last doom and gloom before we pivot off is the average organization, when they get hit, will lose 1/3 of their data. Is probably the easiest way to say that. 1/3 of what gets encrypted does not come back. And so let's spend some time talking about what the 1,000 organizations looked at from a technologies perspective and how they're addressing for that. And to start with, when you're recovering or when you're remediating from ransomware, certainly the goal that everyone has is to get clean data back on the servers, right? And so we asked the very simple question, how did your organization ensure that the data that you were reintroducing into the environment actually was clean? And you see a range of answers here. Dave, I actually want to focus on one, and then I'm going to throw it out. And what I mean by that is in this upper right-hand corner, you see that 31% of organizations said that the way that they're introducing clean data is by making sure the data was immutable. And as our friend Chris Hoff, who I think stood in for me for a couple of weeks while I was out, is very quick to mention, is that immutability doesn't actually mean clean, right? Immutability means that whatever you put in that container is still what's in that container, right? You can have an Nalgene bottle, but is that Nalgene bottle water or bourbon? I'm not going to complain about bourbon, but maybe it's poison, right? You don't know what's in that container. So let's take that 31% that said immutability, and we're going to pull that out of the equation and now look at what's left. Still 550 responses, and how do they ensure the data is clean? Dave, I'm loving that slide on the wedge on that right-hand side. 46%, they're using what Veeam calls a staged restore, but the idea of a sandbox to check that data before it gets reintroduced. Love that.
Yeah, I think almost half the people, if we take out immutability, quote unquote, got it right. Meaning, to your point, before they went back into production, they, in a fenced off, safe way, could do further inspection, interrogate, trust but verify, right? And, that's the name of the game here, is make sure we're not reintroducing something via the restoration process. Now, conversely, though, I'm a little worried if we look over on the left-hand side. Look at the 11% that said we restored it and then we monitored it. So they
because
already
monitoring
brought
worked so well last time, right?
exactly. So detection has already proven to have been a failure point. And so then they restored whatever they had without verifying that first. And then they were going to monitor that for a period of time. But that just means they could have reintroduced day zero threats all over again. So that 11% is not a great answer. Then you look at that 36%, we restored it back to production, and then immediately we scanned it for safety. That's far, far better, of course, than 11%, but it's already been reintroduced back
Right.
into the production environment. So left-hand side is not really the way to proceed. There's varying degrees of better, I'll say,
Yep.
but
Yep.
the best answer there is that right-hand side.
I'm going to go ahead and say there's only one good answer on that slide, right? Anything else is less than good. And when you're talking about ransomware, you should not be doing less than good. All right, so that's kind of the problem statement number one is, are you going to be reintroducing clean data? Now, I was kind of dismissive on, the immutability angle because immutability does not equal cleanliness.
Right.
That said, without immutability, the vast majority of organizations actually don't have data to restore. Right. So let's go ahead and double click into that for a second. So this is a banner that everyone should just write down on a Post-it note. And in fact, for the kids at home, take a screenshot of it right now. Just take a screenshot of that and share it with one of your colleagues in house, because this should really make people concerned. I don't know, Dave, if you had a chance to cover this with Chris while we were gone, but one of the big questions, certainly one of the questions in the earlier research covered how the bad actors target the production environments, but certainly along the way, a lot of them are targeting the backup repository, because that's what's going to ensure you have no choice but to actually pay. I'm going to mute out part of this for a second. Dave, 68% of organizations said those bad actors did actually impact some, if not all, of their repositories. This should keep every backup admin and every CISO up at night.
Yeah, totally agree. And we've got kind of a repeating theme here around that 68%, meaning we saw if we average two different research survey works, that they could only bring back data successfully about 68% of the time, meaning nearly a third of the data was lost. This explains the answer to why might that be the case. At 68%, there was some to complete impact on the backup repository. If you make that, you look at the other way, 31% were unscathed. If we add up the 6 and the 26, only 6, basically 1 out of 20, a little better than that. Let's call it 1 out of 18. The bad actors did not go after the backups as far as they know. But better than 1 out of 4, the bad actors tried but were unsuccessful impacting backups. So what we see here is ransomware is happening a lot. When it happens, they are more often than not going after the backup applications. And when that happens, unfortunately, for those that aren't using best practices, they're getting compromised, getting hit. Now, I do want to pause, make sure we hit the map really quickly as well, because we've had some people come in. Look at that. Okay, so in the United States, in addition to the country, or I'm sorry, states we mentioned of Ohio, Texas, Colorado, we've also got Pennsylvania and New York, and we've got the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, Turkey's come in, and then we've also got Qatar, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, and India. So many thanks for all hours of the day for people checking this out. Be sure to continue commenting and giving us a shout out where you might be tuning in from. So, Jason, you've made the point so far that unfortunately when this hits, it hits hard, meaning about a third or a little bit lower of the data doesn't often get restored successfully. If you're going to restore, you need to have clean restores, meaning make sure you're not reinfecting things. Now we're really looking at, if you think about backups and it's all you back up so you can restore, what's the success associated with that? So what are some answers, some ways out going forward?
So certainly the first step is always going to be around, okay, diversifying the kinds of technologies and repositories that you use so that you have a greater likelihood of survivability, right? So the colloquial phrase for this is don't put all your eggs in one basket. For most folks, you ought to really fixate on that 26%, that green wedge that you're looking at here that says they were unsuccessful in impacting our backups, right? They couldn't affect the repositories. Basically, what you're saying there is that the bad actor tried to remove your only other choice other than paying the ransom, and you beat them at that game. Right. So let's talk about what does that really look like. And so one of the questions we asked right behind that is to look at what technologies are organizations actually using in order to provide that, whether it's offline repositories, whether it's air-gapped repositories, whether it's immutable. There's lots of ways to separate the repository from live access where it can actually be maligned by a bad actor. And so in this case, we came up with a couple different cloud options, a couple different disk options. There's a tape option there. I love the fact that for most organizations, a survivable copy shows up in a hyperscale cloud, right? So we've talked, gosh, Dave, most of this year on how hybrid architectures and embracing cloud is certainly part of every modern production strategy. Should not surprise anybody that it's also part of every modern protection strategy as well. So I love that that's top of mind. One thing that we did to kind of really look at how this kind of comes together, though, is let's figure out what kinds of blends they are. And the punchline here, again, this is another screenshot worthy slide for folks, is in general, 3 out of 4 organizations have a cloud that is in some way offlineable, air gappable, immutable, right? So maybe it's in the technology within that cloud repository. Maybe it's something where those buckets are removed from hot access or not. I mean, there's different ways to do that, but 3 out of 4 organizations have a cloudy protected tier. 2 out of 3, 67%, have an on-premise disk-based tier, which in some way is offlineable, air gappable, immutable, persistent, right? And then Dave, 22% tape. Tape still matters, right? It is hard to get more air gapped than take that tape out of the drive, stick it on a shelf. Can I get an amen from you, brother?
Yeah, absolutely. What I love about this is, of course, this totals up to more than 100, meaning people are using multiple immutable or air-gapped offline strategies, which is absolutely appropriate.
Yep.
And it really shows that there is no one technology, one delivery model that makes sense for everyone, meaning hybrid is a word that we've been using for years. What we clearly see here is a hybrid approach to immutable and offline protection, utilizing cloud services, utilizing on-prem still, utilizing a variety of technologies. That is absolutely appropriate. Here's a great example, Jason, where I think the survey base of about 400 that we got to said they did it and they did it correctly, in my opinion. Now, that 5% is, a little interesting down below, but what we can say is that overall, people are understanding when it comes to protection and remediation against cyber threats, more mechanisms, more capabilities are better than fewer.
Yeah, I think there's a couple nets you can take out of this. So certainly there's that 5% on the bottom, right? That's an exclusive choice. So 5% of organizations said we have no tier of our repository strategy, which has any kind of immutability, air gapping, offline capability, right? So 95% of organizations have at least one tier that is protectable, that is survivable. That said, as you point out, the number comes into about 180%. So on average, organizations have 1.8 tiers. And I love that, right? What this slide really proves, or should prove to organizations, is that your data can be assured to be survivable throughout its entire data lifecycle.
Yes.
Right? The copies that are 30 days old, they ought to be on disk. No reason not to make that disk persistent, right, and survivable. The data that's 2 to 5 years old or for non-regulated data could go to a cloud. No reason that can't be air gappable, immutable, and protectable. For that data that has long-term retention, 10 years, or is governed by regulatory requirements, no reason you couldn't put that on tape along the way. So even as the data moves organically and ages through its life cycle process, it should still be survivable all the way through that ecosystem. So I love the fact that organizations out of the 3 tiers are 1.8 persistent. That means we got 1.2 to go, but I love the direction that's heading.
Yeah, and this notion of double play, triple play immutability, I think is really key. Want to really drive that point home. Whatever you're doing today, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be joining us from. Welcome. I'm joined today by my colleague, Jeff Reichart. And Jeff, you're no stranger to the live stream. I was just looking at this, and I think on episode, is it 98 we're at, that you probably, or maybe it's 97, that you've probably been the most frequent guest. So welcome back.
It's great to be back, and it's great to be talking about ransomware again with you, Dave.
And speaking of back, you're just back from a Veeam in-person event in London. And speaking of the globe, want to give a shout out to everyone where you're tuning in from. Invite you to join the chat and put in a comment where you might be viewing. We've already got, in addition to our production team, which is located in Colorado, that's me. We've got Jeff in the Northeast area, and we've got Mark in Georgia as well. Is our colleague Catrinell overseas in Romania, but we've got we have Germany and Africa already joining, India as well, I see. So be sure to give a shout out on that. And if you have any comments about what we're chatting about, feel free to drop that in. Our production team will get that over to us. So, Jeff, what we've been talking about now for a fair number of weeks has been ransomware. And unfortunately, there's a bad reason why. I was going to say there's a good reason why, but it's really not that good, is it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think that probably most folks who are dialed in are familiar with the ransomware trends report that we just wrapped up. These stats on this slide aren't from that report. They're actually from the data protection trends report. And we asked 3,400 respondents worldwide, mix of large and small organizations in all different verticals, mostly large organizations, mostly over 1,000. But we asked, simple question, how often have you been hit by ransomware in the last 12 months? And Dave, why don't you unpack what we heard?
Yeah, what's interesting is, you always look at the outliers immediately, and only 24% said that they were not compromised by ransomware in the last 12 months. So that means obviously 76% were. And what's concerning, and the reason why we're continuing to double click and offer more data points from that ransomware research is, as you can see here, the top responses were getting hit twice in a 12-month period, or 3 times in a 12-month period. But Jeff, I know you focus a great deal on certain verticals like public sector. What are the results in that environment?
Yeah, the average, as you point out, is between 2 and 3 attacks per year. But our research shows that for folks in public sector, and by that, when we do this survey, we mean both national or federal level government, but also local government and educational institutions we add in with that. When you look at that community of respondents, not only are ransomware attacks the most significant kind of attack or kind of outage that they have, but they're also the most frequent. And for this slide, the stat that bears that out the most clearly is that if you look at the worst statistic here, that is hit more than 6 times by ransomware attacks in the past year, globally, only 1% said that that was their situation, that they'd only been hit, more than 6, only 1% responded yes. If you expand that and look only at public sector, it was actually double that. 2% of our public sector respondents had been hit more than 6 times in the year by ransomware. So it's definitely a significant threat.
Yeah, perfect. And, from now on, meaning the remaining slides, we're going to double click a little bit around the organizational aspect. A couple weeks from now, we're going to be talking more around technology, and I'll call it the kind of the rescue. But Jeff, let's unpack a little bit around the alignment of cybersecurity teams and business continuity disaster recovery professionals. Now, on this first portion of the graphic we're showing, we asked, to what extent do you think the cybersecurity strategies are part of your business continuity disaster recovery strategy, or are they handled separately? The good news, Jeff, I will say is, again, I'll go to the boundary condition, 0% said that cyber and business continuity disaster recovery are handled entirely uniquely. But there is some room for improvement.
There's definite room for improvement. If you look at the stats here, only 40% in the global pool of respondents, and again, this is the big data protection trends report that we do, 3,400 respondents worldwide, or 3,300 and change. 40% said yes, they're completely integrated as one strategy. Before the advent of ransomware, that number would surely have been a lot lower than it is now, right? Because I remember clearly at points in my career that the idea of business continuity and disaster recovery was focused entirely on things like power outages or natural disasters that might take your data center down. Those days are long past, but still only 40% of our respondents said that the cybersecurity and business continuity, or DR, strategies are completely integrated.
Yeah, great point. I mean, again, the good news is it's 0 for saying that they're completely orthogonal. 40% is good, but could be better. I want to pause on that because we've got a lot of activity today. I want to hit the world map again and highlight, you can see obviously Canada, Toronto in particular, brings up a lot of real estate. We also have now joining us Missouri and Texas from North America, as well as Florida. And if we look over at rest of the world, we've got Germany, Netherlands, the UK, Spain, Poland, Armenia, and Czech Republic. And we've got Argentina showing up. And I should not just say Africa. I want to give a special shout out to Mauritania, who, Jeff, I believe maybe the first time we've had that country here on the stream. And then India, of course, as well. So many thanks for all of that. Please keep those comments coming, where you're tuning in from, and anything else you may want to share. So let's now go back to our research around alignment. I purposely kind of saved this one because it's a little bit busy chart, but if we go through and we say, okay, let's look now at the specific roles. We actually, you can see in the fine print here, we interviewed 4 different personas. In the leftmost bar, that's IT operations staff, the backup administrator, second to the left bar, security professionals in the second to the right bar, and then the chief information security officer, or some equivalent IT exec in the right-hand bar. Jeff, what stuck out in your mind across these 4 different roles?
Well, so the interesting things here are that we do have, speaking very generally, broad agreement in the numbers. There's not that terribly much divergence in these. But if we look at the most optimistic number, which is that bright yellow bar here, that our business continuity and DR are completely integrated as one strategy with the cybersecurity posture, the folks in the organization who are least convinced that that's the case are the security and IT professionals.
Yes.
So it looks pretty clear. If you look at the 2 bars, the two graphs on the right, the security professional or the chief information security officer, they're 21 and 19% respectively, who have some serious doubts that their area of expertise, the organization's security posture, has been fully integrated, or integrated maybe as much as it needs to be, into the organization's business continuity and DR plan.
Yeah, and I know, speaking of live events and then what we're describing here, Jeff, at our Veeam in Las Vegas, which we did hybrid, but we returned to live for the first time in 3 years. You actually attended 2 different customer focus groups on ransomware, I believe.
Yeah, and we asked this question. We at Veeam spend a lot of time, and Dave and I spend a lot of time talking with industry analysts, but we also spend a lot of time talking with customers. And obviously what we want to get out of that is a clearer understanding of the challenges and issues that the enterprises that Veeam works with are dealing with, and a clear direction on what Veeam should be doing in response. At those two focus groups, we asked questions about of the attendees who were mostly on the IT operations or storage and backup admin side. We asked this exact question, but we dug down into greater detail and asked, what specific sorts of network monitoring or intrusion detection or endpoint response tools do you have deployed? The answer that we got overwhelmingly from the backup and IT operations side, which in these graphs are the two leftmost bars, were that they weren't in the loop and talked to by their security teams about what different mechanisms were in place. That makes sense if we're talking about keeping information from external communities. You obviously don't want to reveal to potential adversaries what your safeguards are, what your tools are, what your architecture is. But it would be kind of hard for security to be fully implemented into an organization's business continuity and disaster recovery plan if the IT and operations teams don't know what those tools are. So there's definitely, based on the feedback that I got in person, talking with those two groups of customers at Veeam back in May, there's definitely room for improvement.
Yeah, what I think it's interesting, if you look at the backup administrator, that second to the left stacked bar, you kind of see this two ends of the spectrum in terms of the results, meaning the highest response in that light green of completely integrated actually is the backup administrator at 28% versus the other three different constituencies. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, if you add up not integrated or somewhat integrated, that totals 22%, which is also the highest of all four personas.
It's a little schizophrenic. And what I think that points to, I mean, to the extent that the reason that we get this information is so that we can draw conclusions from it. And I think just as I learned having conversations with folks face to face a couple of months ago at Veeam, what this reveals is that to an extent, the backup teams are out of the loop with respect to what the security teams are doing and what they think needs to be done. That we do not have as close a handshake between those groups as we need to.
Yeah, I would agree. And what I would say is positive, though, is I think security teams are very much realizing that backup and recovery in particular plays a strong role in ransomware preparedness and response. But as we'll see now, let me click over to the next slide where we asked this question. Now let's look forward, meaning can we improve our cybersecurity and backup posture? So the question was simple here and kind of the orange in the middle. How much improvement do you believe is required for your organization's IT backup team or teams and your cybersecurity team or teams to be fully aligned? And again, I'll hit the boundary condition, Jeff. That 1% saying no improvement is required. If our colleague Jason was here, he would say, bless their hearts, because that's probably not indicative of real world reality. But what's your take on this particular data?
Well, the security professionals that I work with, the more they know, the more paranoid they are.
Yes.
So yes, no improvement is required is a very unlikely response from folks that are knowledgeable about the current threat landscape. If you add up the numbers that are in different shades of orange on this slide, on this graph, what you get is 52% who say, boy, we need to completely overhaul the integration of cybersecurity and backup, or we need to do significant work on it. So netting it out, we'll leave aside the 1% who live in a perfect world. 52% of our respondents were convinced that there needs to be a lot of additional work done to actually get alignment where it needs to be between the organization's cybersecurity posture and the organization's backup posture.
Yeah, and if we kind of even click on that just a little bit further, want to bring in now on the right-hand side some additional data points here. And what we're seeing here again are the four different personas, so we can cut this data by the different groups. And what I think is interesting is 62% of the backup administrators, if you add up the orange bars there, meaning a complete overhaul at the bottom bar, and then a significant improvement at the second to the bottom bar there. 62% of the backup responses say there's a lot of work to be done. 56% for the security professionals think that there's a lot of work to be done. And if I make one other comment before I pass it over to you, look over at the Chief Information Security Officer on the right-hand side. He or she says, yeah, we're doing just fine, some improvement maybe at 19%, by far the highest. In fact, often cases over double what the backup admin security professionals thinking in that regard.
Yeah, exactly. That 19% is, well, it would be great if they're right, and I can understand why the CISOs would broadcast it that way. If you look at the orange bars here and take that as a sort of the two orange bars added up, that 62% for backup admins and 56% for security professionals, this is kind of the level of doubt, the index of doubt in the organization that things are where they need to be. When I looked at this stat, what struck me is that the two teams of people who are most hands-on, who would have the most reason to know, because they're most deeply involved, where things stand with the integration of these strategies, are also the ones who are most doubtful. And that's the hands-on backup admins and the hands-on security admins.
Yeah, exactly. It's the more of a domain expert you are, the more you're kind of in the trenches, if you will, the more vulnerabilities that you probably experience. But also, I think it's just the nature of the engineering mindset to worry about the gaps, the exposures. And in this case, as we see, our colleague Edwin, he likes to say, the bad guys only have to be right once. The good guys, meaning those protecting the organization and the systems, have to be right. Ideally all the time, but much more often than once, certainly.
Yeah, absolutely true. And let's back up. This might have been something that we've reviewed in the past, but for folks who haven't watched Dave and Jason in particular go through results like this, you might be asking yourself, why does Veeam ask if the answer came from a person whose main job responsibility is IT operations or security professional or backup admin or C-level IT management? And the answer is a lot of what we do is exactly what we're doing now. It's education. First, we educate ourselves by getting this, and then that gives us good guidance on how we need to educate customers, depending on what their role is, about the market realities that are out there. So we may have folks at the C-level who perhaps have a little bit of excessive optimism about how well the integration is going. And it can be helpful to have them see this so that they could go back to their teams and say, well, on average, apparently, if you're hands-on with this, you're not as confident as I am. What's the actual facts? So the goal is to empower ourselves for how we talk about this, but also to empower the people who are on here so that you can have better conversations in your organization about what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I always like to say with any of our research is, you owe it to yourself to get informed. This is industry-wide research. This isn't just about Veeam customers, or this isn't about one certain market segment or one geography. This is a great way, actually, in my opinion, to have a conversation in your organization to say, where do we self-assess that we're at? Do we align with global trends, or do we think we're somewhere to the right or to the left of that? But addressing that ahead of time is actually far more important than trying to come up with after you've been breached.
Yep, absolutely.
So in my mind, Jeff, I could argue that the previous slide, the first slide we opened with, was the most concerning. I'll actually say we're going to bookend with maybe one that's even more concerning. And, let's unpack this. So we asked about incident response teams, or the acronym IRT. The question was, prior to your last cyber event, did your organization's incident response team have a defined ransomware response playbook that incorporated any of the following? So you could choose multiple. And what you see here, Jeff, I'll jump to the bottom. I always like to hit the boundaries. Kind of a good news, but really also a concerning notion. It's good that it's very small at the bottom of the list. 3% say we don't have an incident response team. 5% say we did not have a ransomware playbook. It's good that that falls to the bottom of the list. So that's I guess, glass half full. Now I'll go glass 3/4 empty, which is, if you add that up, that's 8% in this day and age. More than halfway through 2022, ransomware getting as much publicity as it has. Approximately 1 out of 12 organizations are really falling behind, and they're really not prepared. That almost seems hard to imagine in this day and age.
Yeah, it is kind of appalling. I will note we have two big reports, and we use ransomware data from both of those. This one, if you're noticing that the number of respondents is lower than in some of the previous questions we've asked, that's because this is from the ransomware trends report that was released in May at Veeam. This has 1,000 respondents worldwide. In this case, 998 of the folks who were surveyed answered this particular question. And everyone in this survey had actually been hit by a ransomware attack. So this was the criterion for being included in the survey, was you'd been hit by a ransomware attack at least once in the previous year. And to Dave's point, 8% of the folks who admitted that they'd been hit by a ransomware attack had no incident response playbook or incident response team or ransomware playbook. Going to the top of the line, the news is a little bit better, though, because the biggest single stat, and again, these don't add up to 100 because we asked people to select all of the answers that were accurate for their environment. But the one that was selected, the single answer selected by most respondents, was that we do have taking a look at backup copies and assured cleanliness of our backups, assured usability of the backups as a critical thing that we do as part of our playbook for incident response, and verifying that the backups are happening as frequently as they need to be done and that they're useful, that the backups completed successfully, is also part of the solution. That's the second highest single answer. So Dave alluded to the bad news, which is the 8%. But if we look at the top, backup is taken very seriously for incident response. And folks are clear that the work of making sure those backups are going to work for them has to happen before the incident takes place by taking a look at backup logs and making sure that we're backing up as frequently as we need to.
Yeah. And I see we've got a question that's come in. Question is from Powell, who asks, for the Veeam repository, the immutable backup capability, which protocol is best to share, is better to use NFS, and which is the best Linux distribution? I'm going to give a couple comments, Jeff. You feel free to chime in as well. I kind of favor Ubuntu, but I know other people have their preferences. We certainly claim support on several different distributions. I just see it probably in the field, Ubuntu is used quite a bit, so I kind of lean in that direction. Don't know if you see anything differently.
Well, what I've seen customers choose is that or Red Hat Enterprise Linux. If they've gone with Red Hat Enterprise Linux and that's their standard, that's what they go with. In terms of distributions, the key thing is that it has to support XFS, because for the hardened Linux repository, we need to be able to use the XFS file system with immutability tagged for that. In terms of which protocol is better for sharing is to use, the hardened Linux repository is a direct attached storage. So you typically are going to reach it in that respect, not by sharing it out via other sharing protocols. You're going to hit it directly as a direct attached disk repository. And so that's the good answer for that as well. If we look at this, if we look at the stats, I'll just return a little bit here. It's kind of interesting that the answers that we got do cover correctly so many of the different options that you would want to have in an incident response team. One of the things that I found a little bit troubling looking at this is that the isolation plan, the shortest, if you look right in the middle, was only at 24%. So only 24% of respondents, when they talk about things that are a component of their cybersecurity incident response plan, say that they have a plan to isolate the affected systems basically immediately or in a very planned.
The takeaway is that a lot goes into an appropriate plan. A lot goes into having multiple methods and techniques to be able to ensure that you can be as resilient as possible. That's true even outside of ransomware, but it's a good reminder there is no one single silver bullet. So let's take a look at the map one last time. I know that we've had Pennsylvania come through, if I didn't mention before, as well as Massachusetts. I believe Italy and Germany, again, an additional person from Germany's come in. And then someone that's actually from United Arab Emirates, but is currently located in Pakistan, I believe, is also chiming in. So thank you very, very much for that. Really appreciate all the various hours that everyone tunes in live. And Jeff, I should give a shout out that typically within a week or so after we're live, which is on our Monday, we'll see oftentimes 2 or even 3 times as many people replaying this on the various platforms that we stream and persist the data on. So
yeah, lunchtime Eastern time is convenient for you and me, Dave, but the fact is it may not be convenient. And as everyone can see, we've got viewers from all over the world. So we do make this live stream available on all the platforms you can reach it from after the fact. So look forward to those who can't dial in, or if you want to rewatch for any points, please do check it out later on.
Yeah, and just to look ahead now, we are not going to have a Friday Tech Bites this particular Friday, meaning a couple days from now, but we are going to double click on ransomware in terms of the actual techniques and the abilities that Veeam can bring to the table. So a little bit more of a Veeam commercial, if you will, than we're usually doing on these live streams. But in particular, next week, a week from today, Jason will be back in the fold, and our colleague Melissa, who's been on the stream a number of times, they're going to start looking at how you can validate the recovery, how you can orchestrate and automate your response so that we can address that incident response team and plan better than what we saw in the previous chart. Now, 2 weeks from today, myself and one of our top SEs, meaning field engineers, Brad Lynch, he and I are going to go into a little more detail around backup repositories, what we had just commented on around the hardened Linux backup repository, as well as hardening the solution overall. I think what we'll end with, Jeff, is, we've talked a lot about the challenge. We've talked a lot about the opportunity. But next couple of weeks, we want to offer some specifics in terms of best practices and some specifics in terms of Veeam to try to put everyone in a better recovery posture.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Setting the table is not enough. We've also got to put some food on the table. So we're going to have some solutions that you can get more out of over the next couple of weeks to harden your environment and improve your posture.
Well, thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Until the next stream, stay safe, stay positive. Be sure to check out the ransomware research report, as well as some of the past streams that may be of interest. Bye for now.
Thanks, everyone.
Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. I'm Jason Buffington with Veeam. You'll notice that this week I am not joined by my normal colleague, Dave Russell.
No, you're not. I am not Dave Russell.
Not. Dave Russell 2.0, at least as it comes to BCDR. Melissa, thank you for joining us this week.
Thanks for having me, Jason. It's been a while.
It has been a while. Now, for those of you that don't know, Melissa is our lead champion and powerhouse behind Orchestrator and all the technologies of actually how to improve real business continuity and disaster recovery from Veeam. And so, Melissa, I want to kind of set up a problem scenario before we actually get into the data for today's topic. Let's go to the slides for just a second, because I want to kind of walk through, for as long as you and I have been partnering around disaster recovery, there's kind of 3 big goals that almost always come to do. So let me kind of build this out for the folks at home. The first idea was, do you actually have survivable data, right? So do you have data someplace else that you could recover from when your primary production center is on fire, underwater, under earth, stolen, whatever the case may be?
Who knows?
So we talk about that, survivable data. the next thing is, and of course, this is your love language, how do we shrink the time to recover any given workload, right? We're going to talk a little about Orchestrator and some of the things that you've been doing around that. And then lastly, but what if the primary infrastructure is gone? You're not putting it back where it came from. You're putting it back to a secondary site. You're putting it back to a alternative infrastructure or cloud or provider or something. But this is what every disaster looks like: fire, flood, earthquake, tornado, etc. When we talk about, and this is your battle cry, so I'm going to have you weigh in after this, but when we talk about ransomware, right? Ransomware is a disaster. There's a few extra steps that we have to talk through. Walk us through these pivots, and then let's talk about what the data says about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen a lot of people just getting really scared out there when they're thinking about, okay, I know I'm going to get hit by ransomware at one point. What on earth do I do to recover? Well, you start with your disaster recovery plan, which I hope is up to date and tested, but we'll talk about that in a little while. But a couple things change when it comes to a ransomware attack. First of all, we have to determine the sprawl, right? How much was impacted? I mean, if I lost a storage array, I know that everything on that storage array is poof and I need to recover it, right? In the event of a ransomware attack, it might not be immediately evident how much of my environment was compromised. So that becomes a really important thing to consider, how much was impacted. Next is survivable repositories. Are there any copies left? We know these threat actors are out there and they want to make sure you can't recover, right? They want to make sure you pay that ransom. So they're going to try to go after the copies of your data to get rid of them. So we need to make sure that we have copies in a state that they cannot do that. And we need to assess after a ransomware attack, what do we have left, right? And then last but certainly not least, okay, we have data. Is it clean, right? How do we restore this in a fashion that we're just not reintroducing this threat over and over again, right? So we kind of take our regular disaster recovery steps and we add a little bit to them so that we can kind of, prepare for this slightly more unique disaster. And I don't know if unique is the right word. Actually, you know what it is? Because every ransomware attack is different, right? You don't know what exactly is going to happen until it happens. You might be planning for one thing and say, hey, I'm going to recover to my DR site, but guess what? They got in that too. So you got to go to the cloud. So you kind of don't know how it's going to unravel until it unravels.
Sure. So speaking of the breadth of kinds of disasters and the kinds of ransomware attacks that are out there, we probably have a breadth of attendees on today's session, and we'd like to hear from where you are. So our goal always is to turn the world Veeam green.
Absolutely.
I am down in the great state of Texas. Usually Dave Russell is in the state of Colorado, but this week we're going to give, and I think he's dialed in, which is why we still get to flag him green. You are up in the New Jersey area.
Yes.
We've got Felicia doing social media out of Ohio. Our producer is out of Georgia. And our goal, please pile on. Where are you from? And also, by the way, just for the record, please play this back. You have never met someone as strong in BCDR as Melissa Palmer. So if you have questions about disaster recovery and orchestrating, put those into the chat as well. This is a great opportunity to pick her brain. So let's break down some of the data that's there that we did in this last report. This is my favorite part. Data. I love data.
Me too.
So earlier this year, we did a report called the Data Protection Trends Report, largest report of its kind, nearly 3,400 respondents in that data set. And we saw the high frequency of folks that were getting hit by ransomware. So we doubled down and we asked another 1,000 organizations who had been hit by ransomware in 2021. And we asked them, all kinds of things about, were they prepared? How bad was the attack along that way? Here's one of the things I think was most interesting is when organizations were asked, are they ready? Right? And how do you know that you're ready for anything? You test. So I want to get your reaction to this, and then let's kind of nerd on it for a minute.
Okay, so we got 60% of people checking that they're confirming successful backups. So that is better than nothing, but that should be 100. I'm sorry. Like if your backups aren't working, you've missed the boat. If you like that data, you should have backed it up because you can't recover something from ransomware unless you've protected it first. So 60% of you, good job. 40% of you, go check your backups right now. We'll wait. Scripted test restores of data files for readability of media storage. That's good. That's also very good. So we've got 44% of people actually testing if these backups actually work, right? So that's kind of okay, maybe.
Okay,
Maybe.
so I'm gonna poke fun at these for a second because you're actually a much, you know what it is, you're an hour ahead of me, so you probably have had more coffee, but I'm gonna be the pessimist on this for a second, because when the backup logs come back, and Dave Russell and I have poked fun at this already, what the backup logs basically say is the job ran.
Yeah.
One of the more interesting scenarios that I've heard, yeah. One of the more interesting scenarios that I've heard about, though, is when the bad actor actually gets into compromised credentials and changes the backup job. So you're simply removing from the job protected workload. So now the job is green, right? It just so happens that nothing actually got backed up, right? I'm also going to poke fun at the scripted. That middle option is basically what we used to call read after write.
Yeah.
So I wrote to a tape, and then I read from the tape to make sure the same data came back. CRC, there's no corruption. And that was fantastic 25 years ago when tape didn't read well, right? You wrote it to a tape, the buffer crapped out, and all of a sudden you couldn't read from that tape.
Yeah.
Today's modern LTO cartridge is more reliable against bit rot than whatever spindle that you want to put on a drive today. So that ain't, I would technically call you that both of those are almost as red as the 4% of organizations that said, nah, we don't test. We're good.
All
right. So can we please talk about the 16% that got it right?
So 16% of you out there, congratulations, you have it right. You're actually testing if these VMs work or not, right? You're doing a full restore. You're restoring it and you're checking if the application works as expected. And that is what we need to do to be able to prove without a doubt that we can recover from a ransomware attack. I hear lots of cases of people even paying the ransom because they're like, well, we think we can recover, but it's going to take too long. We don't think we can do it in time, right? We got to get everything back. And that's just a whole different thing. You shouldn't do that either. So the only way to truly prove that you are able to recover from a ransomware attack is to do a full restore. And now is the time to do that. Because if you find bottlenecks in your vSphere environment or something doesn't work right, or it just blows up in your face, at least now you know, so you have the time now to fix things before disaster day comes.
I got to give props to Steve Merriman, who said the tape ejected. That means the backup worked, right? If we had more than half an hour, I will tell you about a story where I actually forgot to set up a job that would actually rotate the tapes. And so an admin that I had trained, every week the backup ran on the same tape for 6 concurrent months. They pulled the tape out of the drive. All the magnetic dust was gone. All that was left was the clean cellophane. It was the worst thing ever. Anyway, but yes, props to Steve for keeping this light this morning. Yeah, these are flaws, right? So if you're not actually testing, did the app come back up? So 16% actually do that, right? Can the app actually power up? If you're not in that 16%, that means 5 out of 6. Candidly, and there's a lot of, hey, different ways for different people. No, this is just wrong. If you can't test the app went up, you're not actually testing. Let's go on to our second big thing. And while we're doing that, I'm going to look and check and see if the map's going and how that's going. But let me walk through. We said there's a couple pieces to this puzzle. The first one is, are you testing and validating? The second one is, and this comes back to something I know is near and dear to your heart.
Yes.
We ask organizations, how do we shrink that down? Now, Melissa and I've used this analogy before. I just got back from another scout camp. No surprise. This last week, when we teach the first aid merit badge to scouts, one of the things we specifically talk about is how do you shrink the time between snake bite and hospital, right? Because that defines your probability of success, shrinking the time between snake bite and hospital. We talk about IT. How do we shrink that time? And to first do that, we have to figure out what is the mechanism that you're using for failover. I'm going to ask you to start at 12 o'clock. Work your way around on what do you see on this chart?
Oh dear. We will manually reconfigure user connectivity during the crisis. 29% of respondents think that they're going to get hit by ransomware. They're going to manually recover everything and they're going to be successful. And I don't know how to tell the 29% of you out there that you're going to have a really bad time. It's not going to go well for you.
Melissa, 2 of those 3 things are correct. They're going to discover the outage, they're going to manually reconfigure, and they're going to be successful. 2 out of 3 of those statements are accurate. The other one is bless their hearts.
Yes. And then we're getting like a little better, right? We have predefined scripts for reconnecting resources that are now running remotely. That's a little better. I hope your scripts are up to date. And once of all, I hope you've tested them, especially if new workloads have come onto an application, right? Like one of the great things about VMware is it's so easy to add capacity. Oh, we're in the wall, deploy 10 more application servers. Well, if you never put those 10 application servers in the script, you might not be able to work there, right? So that is better than doing it manually, but there is still a lot of overhead in there, making sure that everything is kept up to date on a regular basis. So I would give them like a C, Jason? Would we give them like a C?
Yeah, but the thing is, I mean, if you look at how this data lays out, so basically collecting these together, 3 out of 4 organizations, there's a couple things that are wrong with this process. 1, it's nearly an all manual process.
Yeah.
And 2, and I'm just going to point this out for the kids at home, it presumes that the subject matter expert is part of the recovery process.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because you're expecting that someone who's actually knowledgeable is going to reconfigure, or someone who's actually knowledgeable is going to invoke and adapt those scripts on the fly. One of the things that real disasters have taught us for years is that in most cases, the original admins are not available. Now, it's not always a catastrophic loss of life event, but often it's not available, right? Floods, fire, geographic problems, power. There's lots of reasons why the subject matter experts aren't available, which means 3 out of 4 of these plans is not going to fail. Now, before we get to the fun part of this, let's take a break for a second. I do want to kind of pull up the map because these answers are all over the map. Let's see where the respondents are as well. See what I did there?
We got a lot of people.
All right. So let's take a look first in the United States or North America. So we got Pennsylvania. It's been a while since we've seen them. New Hampshire's in the house. New York, your neighbors. So good for that. Kentucky, home of my favorite whiskeys and bourbons. State of Washington, state of California. And my neighbors to the south in Mexico all reporting
that's looking
in. So,
mighty green today. That's pretty cool.
Mighty green. Still looking for some Latams and some Canadians to really hit that new hemisphere, but it's a good start. Speaking of green, got Ireland in the house. Always a pleasure there. Germany's in. Dabut, our friends from Italy, are there as well. What do we got else? We got Nigeria. It's been a while since I've been on with Nigeria, so that's awesome. And then I think that's Pakistan in the upper right-hand corner. So thank you also for joining as well. So yeah, let's turn the world green. There's a couple big chunks that haven't weighed in yet, but I'm hoping that they will in short order. And yeah, Cornell, yeah, snake bite to hospital, right? That's how he fixes. So let's go back to that chart because as we said, 3 out of 4 organizations have gotten it wrong. So let's take a look at how do you shrink that time.
And this is like we're just like giving away the secrets, right? We're telling you exactly what you need to do.
Break it down for us, Melissa.
Okay, I can't actually read this. We have orchestrated workflows that will reconnect resources that are now running remotely, right? So you don't have to do anything, right? It's just going to work. You're going to say, I need to run that workflow. You're going to run that workflow and it will automatically do everything for you. You are good to go. And if you're using something like Veeam Disaster Recovery Orchestrator, you can test that and it will tell you exactly how long it will take. So when ransomware day comes and they're like, give us all the Bitcoins or whatever, you can say, I can have you up and running in 8 hours. Let's just go, right?
So I want to talk about the power of workflows for a second. So one of the things that's really important for folks to understand is that humans are really bad at minutia.
They are.
They are even worse, minutia repetitively.
Under pressure. Can we add under pressure to that too?
I was going with that. Worse and then worse still. So in a good, better, best. So now think about this. I am under pressure doing repetitive minutia tasks with my boss's boss standing over my shoulder waiting for things to turn back on again, right? Humans are not built for that. You know what is? Computers. Computers are built for that, right? So in this case, an orchestrated workflow. The other thing I really love about workflows, I don't think enough folks understand, is when you think about those manual scripts, when you think about manually reconfiguring, what often IT pros will do is they'll say like, oh, I'm not really going to move the storage volume over because I know that's going to work. So I'll just test the other pieces, right? Or yeah, I know once the server comes up, it's probably going to it'll come back online because the primary instance of it works just fine when I reboot it. Oh, except that I forgot about that whole DHCP thing and I actually put a static address, right? Right. So the fact that often when we test, we cut a couple corners because we've made a couple assumptions, right? The best part about orchestrated workflows is not just shrinking Snakebite to hospital, but actually knowing that you're going to use the same recipe and the same clicks and the same steps each and every time while you test. So that's the time to figure out where those holes in your plans are. And you can't do that if it's manual. You just can't.
No, you can't.
So all right. So that's the second of the three elements that we see from leveraging orchestration as part of that is the failover mechanisms along the way. I'm going to bring up the third part though, because you've mentioned testing a few times along the way. So this is actually a new slide. This one actually had fallen out of our earlier series from the Data Protection Trends Report. So even though it's not part of the ransomware project, I wanted to bring it up because Melissa, actually, you authored this question in the DPR survey. So you need to be the one to unpack this. Now, let me tell you what we actually did here. So in the 3,400 IT executives around 28 countries around the world that did this survey, about 1,800 of them said they were knowledgeable about their organization's BCDR strategy. That's why the N is 1,800, which, by the way, is still 6x what you would typically see in a normal research project. On the right-hand side, we asked them 3 different questions during the survey. How often do you update your documentation? That's the brightest green on the left.
Yeah.
Then how often do you test a single workload, which we've already talked about, right? That's that middle column, single failover. And then we asked, how often do you test multiple workloads or a site level failure and recovery? And that's that darkest column on the right. And what I noticed when we got the data back was plus or minus a couple percent. It sounds like, I'm going to infer that most organizations are actually doing all of these activities on the same relative cadence, right? There's only a few points of disparity between each of the columns. So we went ahead and averaged it out, and that's the pie chart. Let's just talk to that pie chart for a little while. There's some good news, Melissa. 1 in 5 organizations are updating their BCDR documentation and testing monthly, and I love that.
That is only good news. If you are one of those 5, though,
yay for you.
Okay, right? So right. 1 in 5, you're testing and you're updating your DR docs monthly. That's a pretty good place to be.
That's a fantastic place to be.
Realistically, you can get way more aggressive than that, but monthly, I'm like happy when I see that. I can live with that. But then we start talking about 2 months, 3 months.
Okay, good. Hey, my coffee's kicking in, so let me be optimistic for a second.
Right.
Because if you add the monthlies and the bi-monthlies, that's another 17%. And I'm going to even add in the every 3 months because it still means you can.
I know you're gonna, but that.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be tuning in from. Welcome to episode 99 of our LinkedIn live stream series we've been doing now over the last couple of years. Jason's out today. I'm joined by Brad Lynch. Brad is one of our top SEs and now manager of our system engineering group. And we're both located in Colorado, but he is already out at our Veeam Tech Expo in Austin, Texas, because it wasn't warm enough in Colorado for Brad, so he had to go seek someplace a little toastier. Welcome aboard, Brad.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Really happy to be here for the second time and be part of this ransomware series and a particular topic of the ransomware piece that Veeam covers. That's pretty close to near and dear to my heart here. So appreciate you having me.
Yeah, no, thanks for joining us again. And, we thought it would be good as we kind of wind down our multi-part ransomware series and just talk a little bit Veeam specifics, although some of these things certainly apply to any backup and recovery solution you may use. Before we jump in, though, want to encourage everyone, give a message or a shout out where you might be tuning in from. We've already got a few people that have come in from California to India to I'm in Colorado, as I mentioned, and then Brad's in Texas. We've got production over in Georgia, United States, and let's see, my geography is failing me. We've got another country over there as well. So thanks for that. We'll get back and check on this in a couple different times throughout our segment here. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to jump in with that. I do want to mention that we'll be putting a URL for our ransomware trends report a couple of different times during our live stream. If you're not familiar with that, there you can see VEE.am/RW22. That just means ransomware 22. Jason and I have been referring to that over past number of episodes. It is an independent report. It's not Veeam specific whatsoever. And it actually interviews and details the responses from 1,000 organizations globally that did get attacked by ransomware. And they offer some of the statistics, the trends, and things that came out of that. So if you're looking for air cover to take to your boss about, is this real? Can this really happen? Brad, it really does happen, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. And, probably one of the most important piece of the approach of your ransomware strategy is actually having a backup that's recoverable, right? There's many pieces to the forensics and testing the verification and the rapid recovery piece, which I would maybe argue is the second most important thing. But, as you know, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that immutability, that having a safe copy. So I'm excited for that.
Yeah, if we tee up our first slide, kind of want to frame this a little bit. There's a lot of different things going on in here, and actually this is not exhaustive even, but within the Veeam portfolio, that's what's on the left-hand side, Veeam Backup and Replication, our monitoring and analytics tool, Veeam One, our disaster recovery orchestration solution, and our Kasten product, K10, that focuses on Kubernetes. Brad, our colleague now who's gone off to be an independent analyst, Melissa Palmer, she always likes to say that ransomware is a disaster. So all of these automation capabilities in Veeam One and Veeam Disaster Recovery Orchestrator play a role. On the right-hand side, there's kind of the two bits of the coin, like you mentioned, Brad. There's the backup side, there's the recovery side. While we're not going to double click on it, one of the ones I think is interesting is Secure Restore. If people aren't familiar with that, take us through what the concept behind Secure Restore is.
Yeah, absolutely, Dave. So, what's key here is once you actually have that immutable copy, is then the next phase is you want to most likely test those backups are actually usable, right? As that report and survey that you mentioned, Dave, it's very clear that ransomware can lie dormant for days, weeks, if not even months. So making sure that you're not just backing up dormant ransomware, you need to test those backups. So what Secure Restore does is it gives you the ability to mount those backups and test them with the AV tool of your choosing, really any antivirus tool that has a CLI interface that we can integrate with. And you could automate this, right? You could have this occur after each backup. You could have it occur weekly, quarterly, whatever makes sense to your business. And it'll mount that backup, run the AV scan, and email you a report of, if we found anything that may have been malicious or if everything looks good, just essentially a green thumbs up. And now you can have a little extra comfort, security, insurance, and knowing that if you are hit by a ransomware attack, that you have a copy that's recoverable, which is really key. And just kind of one extra note that is probably most important, and of course it's a biased opinion based on the company I work for, but where Veeam can really stand out in the industry is that rapid, reliable recovery piece, right? Veeam offers the ability to recover off an all-flash array, off of a storage snapshot, off of a replica, right? A replica from backup, where essentially from an RTO perspective, you're talking about just powering on a VM. So your recovery could be seconds. So just that recovery piece, and that's kind of the elephant in the room and a lot of these conversations, Dave, is, we can move a copy to tape, we can move a copy to the cloud, but, you get a notification that, hey, pay us X amount of Bitcoin to this account. And the CFO goes to the director of IT and says, hey, how fast can you bring up 1,000 VMs and 700 terabytes of data? And if your director of IT sees some of the data is in the cloud and, on the disk-based repository and on tape, and if his or her answer is, 2 or 3 days, and, that's $5 million, $10 million a day to the business to be down, plus the brand reputation associated with that. And the hackers are asking for a measly $1 million, the CFO might have a very easy decision on his or her hands. So that ability to recover quickly and the options that you have, I find is always that elephant in the room. Is like, hey, we can do everything we want here. We can do forensics detection. We can do immutable air gap copies. But let's really make sure that you can actually recover this data in a SLA that meets the business needs.
Yeah, great point. And if we kind of think about the steps that are involved, one way to sort of triage this is a three-part approach. Protecting with immutable backups, and we'll focus the balance of this conversation or this live stream predominantly on that. But there's also the detection, the monitoring side, and the testing and the verification along the lines of what you were mentioning there, Brad. And what I want to do, though, before we jump into the meat of things, let's go hit the world map again. I think we've got some activity, I'm told. Numerous people actually in California, very warm desert, American Southwest, someone says. Ohio, we've also got, and looking across the world, we've got the Czech Republic, Denmark, interestingly enough, Cayman Islands, which is, I don't know if we've had them before, Brazil, you can see here. And then we've also got Morocco, Nigeria, Mozambique, one that we don't see a lot of. So welcome. Nigeria, we actually do see pretty frequently, and welcome Morocco. And then India and Pakistan as well. So really all corners of the globe. So thank you very much for tuning in, and keep your comments coming where you might be tuning in from. But as we kind of look at our best practices, this is an industry accepted term, meaning 3-2-1, which interestingly enough, our buddy Curtis Preston, who's over at Druva actually, but has been in the business a long time, and he likes to talk about the 3-2-1 rule. It actually came from digital photography, not just from the data center. But Brad, we added some extra digits here a couple of years ago at Veeam. That's why they're Veeam Green. Maybe for those that might not be familiar with it, if you could take us through, and as a kind of a precursor to set you up, I always like to point out, and I'm curious your take on this, but the 3-2-1 aspects in my mind, I view those as minimum, meaning it's not saying 3 copies and 4 are bad. In fact, I oftentimes make 5 copies of my data personally. So I view these as kind of minimum recommendations.
Absolutely, Dave. And there's really, and we're going to talk about this more, but there's really 2 scenarios when it comes to a hacker compromising your backups. Scenario 1 is they get into the Veeam server and start deleting backups. Scenario 2 is they actually get onto the repository server itself and start deleting or encrypting or essentially making these backup files useless. And that's where the addition of the 1 and the 0 come from, right? Making sure you actually have a copy that's immutable, and making sure that, we touched on it and with the secure restore feature and the sure backup features, making sure you're actually testing and verifying that those backups are actually usable and you're not just backing up dormant ransomware or encrypted files or things of that nature. So that's where really that additional 1 and 0 take place, because if you're not meeting that, you're really leaving yourself open to serious vulnerabilities in both scenarios, right? Where they log on to the Veeam console or the repository and they can willy-nilly start removing files, and we'll highlight going forward how 1 and 0 prevent that. I do kind of want to put it back on you, Dave, because a question I get asked almost weekly when I'm talking to customers is, air gapped and immutable. You hear those terms all the time, and what are the differences? Is there a difference? And I'm curious what your take on that is.
Yeah, I kind of view it as a continuum. Generally at Veeam, we're kind of operating under the assumption that they're fairly interchangeable, meaning air gap and immutability. If you want to put a closer lens on it, you could argue to be truly air gapped, something like tape, or in my case, I do use an ejected drive. Once my nightly Veeam backup is done, it logically ejects a USB-C attached SSD drive or flash drive from my system. So it's physically still there, but the literally the volume manager cannot see the drive. So from a hacker perspective, it is air gapped. But I generally think of them pretty much the same. If you want to try to, really zoom in, you could make the case that to be air gapped, there should be some kind of logical or ideally even physical separation between the media where you've written to and what you can get access to. But really the point is just trying to put up a better perimeter so that you can't, run unencumbered and go and attack. And I was actually, a little bit of nerd humor. Our buddy Anthony Spiteri turned me on to a podcast series I listened to 3 episodes yesterday as I walked around. The podcast is called Darknet Diaries. And the one episode I listened to was detailing the Saudi Aramco hack that's believed to be the biggest hack or the most destructive ransomware event in history to this point. They had an enormously flat network. And what that basically meant is once the bad actors got in, they could run unabated. There were no kind of bulkheaded off areas. So here's a clear case, besides proper zoning and other kinds of capabilities, if they did have immutable copies of their data located really at any point, they would have been so much better off because literally 85% of their systems were taken out in one foul swoop.
Wow, that's a crazy story. Yeah, and to build off that just a tad, right, is that's where that elephant in the room comes into play in these conversations, really around that air gapped and immutable conversation, right? And it's not that I'm totally for an air gapped solution. Just make sure and ask yourself the question, hey, if air gapped, it's air gapped or nothing to your business, make sure that it's actually recoverable in a timely manner. Because if it's not, and you're talking about tape, which tape is great, it's making a comeback, but if it's not going to meet the RTOs that the business needs in a true attack, then you might need to rethink the solution that you're architecting, right? So, that's all I just kind of want to add to that piece.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And if we kind of zoom in now a little bit from a Veeam perspective, again, these can conceptually apply to any backup recovery software. But Veeam very much like to promote a notion of flexibility, meaning not dictate the infrastructure. So we look at a policy here from a backup perspective or secondary copy perspective of 3 different tiers. I got a performance tier where data first lands, and that could be comprised of a variety of different sources: direct attach, network attached file share, deduplication appliances, or something that we introduced a while ago called our hardened Linux repository. And let's build out the rest of the tiers here, Brad. Hardened Linux repository or hardened repository, we've got the lock symbol associated with that. Maybe just comment a little bit about what's going on with the hardened Linux repository from a Veeam backup perspective.
Yeah, absolutely, Dave. So, this is something Veeam came out with a little while ago, and this offers the capability to back up to any type of Linux repository and harden it. And what that means is when you back up to a Linux repository, we mark those files as immutable. So I described kind of 2 scenarios earlier, right? Scenario 1, the hacker gets into the Veeam server, gets excited, starts deleting everything. Well, as we'll show in a little bit, they would get an access denied there. It would say, hey, you mark these files as immutable for 30 days, whatever, insert whatever amount of days you want, and we can't remove those files until that expiration date hits. And furthermore, scenario 2, right? Scenario 2 is they actually log on to the Linux box itself. And what's so important about this functionality is that we have the concept of a single-use credential. So when you add this server to Veeam, we don't store those credentials anywhere. It's gone. And I don't want to call it a paranoia, but if you want to take an extra healthy paranoid step, you could disable SSH after that. So now you're talking about a scenario where somebody needs to physically access this box to go and delete files. So you're talking about a very grand scheme where a hacker's probably social engineered his or her way into your data center. So this is a very nice secure option we want. And to your point, Dave, version 12 we're only going to add more options here with integrations with HP Store Once immutability. So that on-prem repository that you're backing up to, you'll have additional options in terms of a first tier immutable backup.
Great explanation. And yeah, we'll double click a little bit more on actually see the hard Linux repository in action, but building out the rest of the tiers as we go from left to right. So then in the middle, we've got a capacity tier where things can either be written to immediately or age out over time. Multiple different options there, from different object storage targets, public cloud targets, obviously private cloud. And today, offering immutability around Amazon S3, all S3 compatible solutions that support this same object locked construct. And since we did mention version 12, meaning the next release of Veeam that will be coming out, we're going to have support for Microsoft Azure immutability as well. So we'll be actually adding a third lock, if you will, in the capacity tier. And then the archive tier going off to colder storage. And I'm not pictured here, but Brad, you did mention it earlier, certainly physical tape support as well, which truly is, like you say, making a comeback. It may not be your recovery of first resort, but especially if you've already made investments in physical tape, LTO9 and that generation, or approximately around there, is a very affordable, very good recovery of last resort. And I wanted to give a little shout out, a lot of partners that we've got, but I'll mention Wasabi in the capacity tier, the archive tier, because we actually have an amazing number of petabytes, hundreds of petabytes with Wasabi, in addition to some of our other partners. So we talked about it earlier, but this is actually snippets of the Veeam backup and replication console. Maybe just walk us through again what you described verbally on the previous section.
Yeah, absolutely, Dave. Yeah, I might have led the witness a little bit too much on the previous one, but this really kind of zooms in a layer deeper on what we're talking about here, right? So as you can see here, you add in that Linux server, you give us the DNS or IP, and it's a single use credential, meaning we only use that credential for that first add of the repository when we deploy our Veeam services, and then Veeam doesn't store it anywhere. It's a non-root account, and then furthermore, right, I call it a healthy paranoia. But if you really want to take that extra next step, you could disable SSH. You certainly don't have to, but once we install our services, you can disable SSH. And once again, right, you're talking about now the only way is for somebody to have physical access to this box to log on to the console and SSH into the box.
Yeah, and I love the part at the bottom there about XFS and utilizing block cloning for additional speed. When I turned on actually XFS in my home lab, I could not believe the synthetic processing, how much that sped up.
Yep, absolutely. That's definitely a feature that should almost be a requirement. It's a huge space saver.
Yeah. So let's hit the map again if we could. I could see. Okay, yes, Florida has come in. We've got Mexico as well, and looks like Sweden, France, Netherlands, Portugal. Also got Peru and Chile. So quite a bit of South American sponsorship and attendance today. And then we've got Tunisia as well. So hitting many quarters of the globe. Thank you very much for that. Appreciate it. Keep the comments coming. So if we go back and just look at, to your point, I'll be the slide clicker and you do the talk track, because you mentioned we're going to actually see what would happen if you were to try to go delete something.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So just to go back to those two scenarios, right? So the two scenarios that a hacker is going to try to delete your backups in, one's that they log on to the actual Veeam console itself. So you can go ahead and click, Dave. Yeah, so right in this scenario, they come in, they go to your backups, and they actually start to try to delete files. Well, they would get this error that says, hey, unable to delete backups. You said that these should be immutable till X amount of days, and we won't delete them until then. So scenario one, they can't get into deleting your backups from the actual Veeam console itself. And then scenario two, if you go ahead and give us another click here, is Now let's say somehow they try to log onto the console. Now, in theory, they wouldn't even see this because they can't SSH into the box, right? They can't get the credentials from Veeam. We don't store them anywhere. And so unless they're physically accessing your data center, they're not even going to get this. And even if they did, right, they would have had to get the credentials from somewhere, and it wouldn't have been from Veeam. But in the case where they actually do log on, they would see this I associated with backup files. So for anybody familiar with Veeam, VBKs, VIBs, VBMs, those are our backup file types. And these backup file types are locked. They have an I immutability flag associated with them, and they're unable to delete until that actual expiration date hits. So just kind of, Dave and I are just really double reinforcing the point here and zooming in a layer deeper that from kind of both scenarios, you have a very nice level of protection here.
Yeah. Yep. Perfect. And if we kind of look to see this in action, what you see there in the middle is the operation did indeed fail. It's flagged as an immutable backup. This is if you're not familiar with it, the Veeam console, and the status steps are showing that there indeed could not go and delete anything before its designated amount of retention has been met.
Yeah, well, and just a quick add there, Dave, is that now this is actually that object storage repository, right? This is AWS, Wasabi, Azure Blob in version 12. Just to give a little shout out, there's a lot of on-prem S3 vendors. So EMC ECS, I think, is actually second or third in terms of amount of data that's stored, because a lot of our, Fortune 100 companies are big, can be big Dell shops. So they have EMC ECS. But the point that this is highlighting is now, okay, we can't delete your Linux on-prem repository. Let's go try to delete your backups located in object storage, and they get the same error. And furthermore, if they were to log onto your AWS console or your whatever S3 provider you use, that console, it would be a similar access denied error. So just highlighting that both your on-prem and your offsite immutable copies, that the hacker or the bad actor in this scenario would get the same access denied regardless of where the backup file is located.
Great point there. If we just look ahead just a little bit now, mentioned flexibility a couple different times. The thing I always think is interesting, and our colleague Rick Vanover likes to say, Veeam operates from the basement lab all the way to the bank, the Fortune 100. And part of the reason for that is being software only can deploy in a number of different ways, but on a lot of different infrastructure. So storage agnosticism certainly comes into play here. That change of deployment, either as your business expands, or to your point earlier about when you really sit down and do a design tabletop exercise, do you actually have the ability to meet what your business requirements might be or have evolved to? And if not, then you can certainly reconfigure your deployment. And then, looking at from a scale perspective, we can definitely scale out the components that we need when we need to. I like to, Brad, sometimes, make the point that the version of Veeam that runs on my Lenovo laptop is the exact same binary that runs at a major bank protecting 8 petabytes of data. The difference, of course, is they're protecting 20,000 machines with heavyweight infrastructure as compared to the resources that my laptop may have. And then the last piece here, I'll let you take this one, but tell us in the field perspective about this notion of number 3 future proofing.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So, I mean, out there, everybody's signing, 1 or 3 year, occasionally a 5-year contract. And, for the most part, it's very rare I meet a customer who's used the same vendor, software, hardware, data protection, storage, whatever it might be, servers. They've used the same vendor for 10, 20 years, right? Things evolve, budgets change, requirements change, SLAs change. So, what's really key about this is Veeam being software only and having integrations with dozens of different vendors is there's no lock-in into a specific storage vendor, server vendor, whatever it might be. So it just gives you a lot of flexibility in that point, and really all three of these bullets right here, Dave. I mean, this is where, once again, bias, but this is where I find that Veeam sets it apart. It's always a balance of when folks are putting together their ransomware defense strategy. It's this balance of kind of budget and speed. And from a Veeam perspective, if you kind of have an open checkbook, I mean, we can give you recovery options that are out of this world in terms of having compute and data store space in another data center and have a replica ready to turn on if you're treating ransomware as if it's a tier 1 DR, which budget's really key, and you're trying to put together a solution on a budget. We can easily integrate with LTO9, as you mentioned, with tape, and have offsite copies ready to go. So these 3 bullets are really near and dear to Veeam's heart, in that it's very simple to architect and design a solution to meet the needs of both that budget and speed to find the right balance for a business. So yeah.
Great point. Great point. Oh, I see you've got a comment from Joe. Joe says, as an IRIX administrator, I'm happy to see XFS is still in use. I've used it since it was, quote, invented. So IRIX, you don't hear about that operating system every day of the week, at least in my world or circles. So thanks for that comment, Joe. And as we wrap up, just want to put this back up. We touched upon but a few of the capabilities. We obviously wanted to pick a couple of the most impactful ones and make the point that there's really flexibility in how you deploy that. So Brad, super shout out. Thanks for coming back and joining us on the stream, and look forward to seeing you in Austin later today. And want to give a shout out to people to check out the ransomware trends report. You can download that. 1,000 organizations providing feedback of what they learned from attacks that hit their organization. And looking ahead, this Friday, 1 hour earlier than what we went on air today with, meaning if you're on U.S. East Coast, it would be 11 a.m. We're going to have a celebration for the 23rd annual SysAdmin Day. And our colleague, Rick Vanover from Veeam, of course, and one of our great partners, Opti9, Siggy Brody, the Chief Technology Officer there. Rick and Siggy are going to be on streaming, and they're going to have a lot of tech prizes that they're giving away. And then 1 week from today will be episode 100 of our live stream here that we're doing on Mondays. We're going to have, for the first time, I believe first time, and correct me, production team, if I'm off on that, but we've not ever had our Chief Technology Officer from Veeam, Danny Allen, attend. So Brad, we've had you on twice because we value, your opinion, but we figured we better kind of mix it up and bring in our boss too, and let him do a little bit of visiting. So be sure to check that out. Thank you very much, Brad. I really appreciate you jumping in and taking us through and bringing the real world perspective to this.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I'm excited for folks who get to tune in next week with Danny. Be very insightful.
Yeah, really. No, all seriousness, it really is. Thanks everyone globally for tuning in. Stay safe, stay positive, and we'll see you on the next live stream.